Aho, Mitakuye, I say hello, all my relations. How y'all doing? My name is the Lucky Coyote, and today we are going to be reading some Edgar Allan Poe. Probably for the next few weeks. So, I hope you all enjoy it. I'm trying to pull up my multi-stream chat. It's not showing for me. That's kind of weird. Let's see now. Pull it back up. There we go. It was just being a little odd. Anyway, want to thank you all for coming out. And let's get to it. Yeah, quite a long book. All right. This first one is entitled The Unparalleled Adventure of one Hans Pfaall. With a heart of furious fancies, whereof I am commander, with a burning spear and a horse of air, to the wilderness I wander. Tom O'Bedlam's Song. By late accounts from Rotterdam, that city seems to be in a high state of philosophical excitement. Indeed, phenomena have here occurred of a nature so completely unexpected, so entirely novel, so utterly at variance with preconceived opinions, as to leave no doubt on my mind that long ere this all Europe is in an uproar, all physics in a ferment, all reason and astronomy together by the ears. It appears that on the day of, I am not positive about the date, A vast crowd of people, for purposes not specifically mentioned, were assembled in the great square of the Exchange in the well-conditioned city of Rotterdam. The day was warm, unusually so for the season. There was hardly a breath of air stirring, and the multitude were in no bad humor at being now and then bespectacled with the friendly showers of momentary duration that fell from large white masses of cloud profusely distributed about the blue vault of the firmament. Nevertheless, about noon, a slight but remarkable agitation became apparent in the assembly. The chattering of 10,000 tongues succeeded, and, in an instant afterwards, 10,000 faces were turned toward the heavens. 10,000 pipes descended simultaneously from the corners of 10,000 mouths, and a shout, which could be compared to nothing but the roaring of Niagara, sounded long, loudly, and furiously through all the city and through all the environs of Rotterdam. The origin of this hubbub soon became sufficiently evident. From behind the huge bulk of one of those sharply defined masses of cloud already mentioned was seen slowly to emerge into an open area of blue space, a queer, heterogeneous, but apparently solid substance, so oddly shaped, so whimsically put together, as not to be in any manner comprehended, and never to be sufficiently admired, by the host of sturdy burghers who stood open-mouthed below. What could it be? In the name of all the devils of Rotterdam, what could it possibly portend? No one knew. No one could imagine. No one, not even the burgomaster, Mynheer Superus von Undrich, had the slightest clue which to unravel the mystery. So as nothing more reasonable could be done, every one to a man replaced his pipe carefully in the corner of his mouth, and maintaining an eye steadily upon the phenomenon, puffed, paused, waddled about, and grunted significantly, then waddled back, grunted, paused, and finally puffed again. In the meantime, however, lower and still lower toward the goodly city came the object of so much curiosity and the cause of so much smoke. In a very few minutes it arrived near enough to be accurately discerned. It appeared to be, yes, it was, undoubtedly, a species of balloon. But surely no such balloon had ever been seen in Rotterdam before. For who, let me ask, ever heard of a balloon manufactured entirely of dirty newspapers? No man in Holland, certainly. Yet here, under the very noses of the people, or rather at some distance above their noses, was the identical thing in question, and composed, I have it on best authority, of the precise material which no one had ever known before to be used for a similar purpose. It was an egregious insult to the good sense of the burghers of Rotterdam. As to the shape of the phenomenon, it was even still more reprehensible, being little or nothing better than a huge fool's cap turned upside down, and this similitude was regarded as by no means lessened when, upon nearer inspection, the crowd saw a large tassel descending from its apex, and, around the upper rim or base of the cone, a circle of little instruments resembling sheep bells, which kept up a continual tinkling to the tune of Betty Martin. Still worse, suspended by blue ribbons to the end of this fantastic machine, there hung, by way of car, an enormous drab beaver hat, with a brim superlatively broad and hemispherical crown, with a black band and a silver buckle. It is, however, somewhat remarkable that many citizens of Rotterdam swore to having seen the same hat repeatedly before, and indeed the whole assembly seemed to regard it with eyes of familiarity, while the Vrouw Gretel Pfaall, upon seeing it, uttered an exclamation of joyful surprise, and declared it to be the identical hat of her good man himself. Now this was a circumstance the more to be observed, as Pfaall, with his 3 companions, had actually disappeared from Rotterdam about 5 years before, in a very sudden and unaccountable manner, and up to the date of this narrative all attempts at obtaining intelligence concerning them had failed. To be sure, some bones which were thought to be human, mixed up with a quantity of odd-looking rubbish, had been lately discovered in a retired situation to the east of the city, and some people went so far as to imagine that in this spot a foul murder had been committed, and that the sufferers were in all probability Hans Pfaall and his associates. But to return. The balloon, for such no doubt as it was, had now descended to within 100 feet of the earth, allowing the crowd below to a sufficiently distinct view of the person of its occupant. This was, in truth, a very singular somebody. He could not have been more than 2 feet in height, but this altitude, little as it was, would have been sufficient to destroy his equilibrium and tilt him over the edge of his tiny car. But for the intervention of a circular rim reaching as high as the breast and rigged onto the cords of the balloon, the body of the little man was more than proportionately broad, giving to his entire figure a roundity highly absurd. His feet, of course, could not be seen at all. His hands were enormously large, his hair was grey, and collected into a queue behind. His nose was prodigiously long, crooked, and inflammatory, his eyes full, brilliant, and acute. His chin and cheeks, although wrinkled with age, were broad, puffy, and double. But of ears of any kind there was not a semblance to be discovered upon any portion of his head. This odd little gentleman was dressed in a loose surcoat of sky-blue satin, with tight breeches to match, fastened with silver buckles at the knees. His vest was of some bright yellow material. A white taffeted cap was set jauntily on one side of his head, and, to complete his equipment, a blood-red silk handkerchief enveloped his throat and fell down, in a dainty manner, upon his bosom in a fantastic bow-knot of supereminent dimensions. Thank you, Lethal Cade. I love having you here. Having descended, as I said before, to about 100 feet from the surface of the earth, the little old gentleman was suddenly seized with a fit of trepidation and appeared disinclined to make any nearer approach to terra firma. Throwing out, therefore, a quantity of sand from a canvas bag, which he lifted with great difficulty, he became stationary in an instant. He then proceeded, in a hurried and agitated manner, to extract from a side pocket in his surcoat a large morocco pocket-book. This he poised suspiciously in his hand, then eyed it with an air of extreme surprise, and was evidently astonished at its weight. He at length opened it, and drawing therefrom a huge letter sealed with red sealing-wax and tied carefully with red tape, let it fall precisely at the feet of the burgomaster, Superbus von Underduk. His Excellency stooped to take it up, but the aeronaut, still greatly discomposed, and having apparently no further business to detain him in Rotterdam, began at this moment to make a busy preparations for departure, and it being necessary to discharge a portion of ballast to enable him to reascend, the half-dozen bags which he threw out, one after another, without taking the trouble to empty their contents, tumbled, every one of them, most unfortunately, upon the back of the burgomaster, and rolled him over and over no less than half a dozen times, in the face of every individual in Rotterdam. It is not to be supposed, however, that the great Onderduk suffered this impertinence on the part of the little old man to pass off with impunity. It is said, on the contrary, that during each of his half-dozen circumvolutions he emitted no less than half a dozen distinct and furious whiffs from his pipe, to which he held fast the whole time with all his might, and to which he intends holding fast, God willing, until the day of his decease. In the meantime, the balloon arose like a lark, and, soaring far away above the city, at length drifted quietly behind a cloud similar to that from which it had so oddly emerged, and was thus lost forever to the wandering eyes of the good citizens of Rotterdam. All attention was now directed to the letter, the descent of which, and the consequences attending thereupon, had proved so fatally subversive of both person and personal dignity to His Excellency von Onderduk. That functionary, however, had not failed, during his circumgyratory movements, to bestow a thought upon the important object of securing the epistle, which was seen, upon inspection, to have fallen into the most proper hands, being actually addressed to himself and Professor Rubadub, in their official capacities of President and Vice President of the Rotterdam College of Astronomy. It was accordingly opened by those dignitaries upon the spot, and found to contain the following extraordinary and indeed very serious communication. Quote, "To their Excellencies von Onderduk and Rubadub, President and Vice President of the States College of Astronomers in the city of Rotterdam. Your Excellencies may perhaps be able to remember an humble artisan by the name Hans Pfaall, and by occupation a member of Bellows, who, with 3 others, disappeared from Rotterdam about 5 years ago, in a matter which must have been considered unaccountable. If, however, it so please your Excellencies, I, the writer of this communication, am the identical Hans Pfaall himself. It is well known to most of my fellow citizens that for the period of 40 years I continued to occupy the little square brick building at the head of the alley called Sauerkraut, in which I resided at the time of my disappearance. My ancestors have also resided therein time out of mind, they, as well as myself, steadily following the respectable and indeed lucrative profession of mending of bellows, for, to speak the truth, until of late years, that the heads of all the people have been set agog with politics. No better business than my own could an honest citizen of Rotterdam either desire or deserve. Credit was good, employment never wanting, and there was no lack of either money or goodwill. But as I was saying, we soon began to feel the effects of liberty and long speeches and radicalism and all that sort of thing. People who were formerly the best customers in the world had now not a moment of time to think of us at all. They had as much as they could do to read about the revolutions and keep up with the march of intellect and the spirit of the age. If a fire wanted fanning, it could readily be fanned with a newspaper, and as the government grew weaker, I have no doubt that leather and iron acquired durability in proportion, for, in a very short time, there was not a pair of bellows in all Rotterdam that ever stood in need of a stitch or required the assistance of a hammer. This was a state of things not to be endured. I soon grew as poor as a rat, and, having a wife and children to provide for, my burdens at length became intolerable, and I spent hour after hour in reflecting upon the most convenient method of putting an end to my life. Duns, in the meantime, left me little leisure for contemplation. My house was literally besieged from morning till night. There were 3 fellows in particular who worried me beyond endurance, keeping watch continually about my door, and threatening me with the law. Upon these 3 I vowed the bitterest revenge if ever I should be so happy as to get them within my clutches, and I believe nothing in the world but the pleasure of this anticipation prevented me from putting my plan of suicide into immediate execution. By blowing my brains out with a blunderbuss, I thought it best, however, to disassemble my wrath, and to treat them with promises and fair words until, by some good turn of fate, an opportunity of vengeance should be afforded me. One day, having given them the slip, and feeling more than unusually dejected, I continued for a long time to wander about the most obscure streets without object, until at length I chanced to stumble against a corner of a bookseller's stall. Seeing a chair close at hand for the use of customers, I threw myself doggedly into it, and, hardly knowing why, opened the pages of the first volume which came within my reach. It proved to be a small pamphlet treatise on speculative astronomy, written either by Professor Ankel of Berlin or by a Frenchman of somewhat similar name. I had some little tincture of information on matters of this nature, and soon became more and more absorbed in the contents of the book, reading it actually through twice before I awoke to a recollection of what was passing around me. By this time it began to grow dark, and I directed my steps toward home. But the treatise, in conjunction with a discovery in pneumatics, lately communicated to me as an important secret by a cousin from Nantes, and had made an indelible impression on my mind, and, as I sauntered along the dusty streets, I resolved carefully over in my memory the wild and sometimes unintelligible reasonings of the writer. There are some particular passages which affected my imagination in an extraordinary manner. The longer I meditated upon these, the more intense grew the interest which had been excited within me. The limited nature of my education in general, and more especially my ignorance on subjects connected with natural philosophy, so far from rendering me diffident of my own ability to comprehend what I had read, or inducing me to mistrust the many vague notions which had arisen in consequence, merely served as a farther stimulus to imagination. And I was vain enough, or perhaps reasonable enough, to doubt whether those crude ideas which, arising in ill-regulated minds, have all the appearance, may not often in effect possess all the force, the reality, and other inherent properties of instinct or intuition. It was late when I reached home, and I went immediately to bed. My mind, however, was too much occupied to sleep. I lay the whole night buried in meditation. Arising early in the morning, I repaired eagerly to the bookseller's stall and laid out what little ready money I possessed in the purchase of some volumes of mechanics and practical astronomy. Having arrived at home safely with these, I devoted every spare moment to their perusal, and soon made such proficiency in studies of this nature as I thought sufficient for the execution of a certain design with which either the devil or my better genius had inspired me. In the intervals of this period, I made every endeavor to conciliate the 3 creditors who had given me so much annoyance. In this I finally succeeded, partly by selling enough of my household furniture to satisfy a moiety of their claim, and partly by a promise of paying the balance upon completion of a little project which I told them I had in view, and for assistance in which I solicited their services. By these means, for they were ignorant men, I found little difficulty in gaining them over to my purpose. Matters being thus arranged, I contrived, by the aid of my wife, and with the greatest secrecy and caution, to dispose of what property I had remaining, and to borrow in small sums, under various pretenses, and without giving any attention, I am ashamed to say, to my future means of repayment, no inconsiderable quantity of ready money. With the means thus accruing, I proceeded to procure at intervals cambric muslin, very fine, in pieces of 12 yards each, twine, a lot of the varnish of Calthoric, a large and deep basket of wicker work made to order, and several other articles necessary in the construction and equipment of a balloon of extraordinary dimensions. This I directed my wife to make up as soon as possible, and gave her all requisite information as to the particular method of proceeding. In the meantime, I worked up the twine into network of sufficient dimensions, rigged it with a hoop and the necessary cords, and made purchase of numerous instruments and materials for experiment in the upper regions of the upper atmosphere. I then took opportunities of conveying by night to a retired situation east of Rotterdam 5 iron-bound casks to contain about 50 gallons each, and one of a larger size, 6 tin tubes, 3 inches in diameter, properly shaped, and 10 feet in length, a quantity of particular metallic substance or semi-metal, which I shall not name, and a dozen demijohns of a very common acid. The gas to be formed from these later materials is a gas never yet generated by any other person than myself, or at least never applied to any similar purpose. I can only venture to say here that it is a continuant of azote, so long considered irreducible, and that its density is about 37.4 times less than that of hydrogen. It is tasteless, but not odorless, burns, when pure, with a greenish flame, and is instantaneously fatal to animal life. Its full secret I would make no difficulty in disclosing, but that it of right belongs, as I have before hinted, to a citizen of Nantes in France, by whom it was continually communicated to myself. The same individual submitted to me, without being at all aware of my intentions, a method of constructing balloons from the membrane of a certain animal, through which substance any escape of gas was nearly an impossibility. I found it, however, altogether too expensive, and was not sure, upon the whole, whether cambric muslin with a coating of gum cathodic was not equally as good. I mention this circumstance because I think it probable that hereafter the individual in question may attempt a balloon ascension with the novel gas and material I have spoken of, and I do not wish to deprive him of the honor of a very singular invention. On the spot which I intended each of the smaller casks to occupy respectively during the inflation of the balloon, I privately dug a small hole, the holes forming in this manner a circle 25 feet in diameter. In the center of this circle, being the station designed for the large cask, I also dug a hole of greater depth. In each of the 5 similar holes, I deposited a canister containing 50 pounds, and in the larger one, a keg holding 150 pounds of cannon powder. These, the keg and canisters, I connected in a proper manner with covered trains, and having let into one of the canisters the end of about 4 feet of slow match, I covered up the hole and placed the cask over it, leaving the other end of the match protruding about an inch and barely visible beyond the cask. I then filled up the remaining holes and placed the barrels over them in their desired situation. Besides the articles above enumerated, I conveyed to the depot and there secreted one of M. Grimm's improvements upon the apparatus for condensation of the atmospheric air. I found this machine, however, to require considerable alteration before it could be adapted to the purposes to which I intended making it applicable. But, with severe labor and unremitting perseverance, I at length met with entire success in all my preparations. My balloon was soon completed. It would contain more than 40,000 cubic feet of gas, would take me up easily, I calculated, with all my implements, and, if I managed rightly, with 175 pounds of ballast into the bargain. It had received 3 coats of varnish, and I found the cambric muslin to answer all the purposes of silk itself, being quite as strong and a good deal less expensive. Everything being now ready, I exacted from my wife an oath of secrecy in relation to all my actions from the day of my first visit to the bookseller's stall, and promising, on my part, to return as soon as circumstances would permit. I gave her what little money I had left, and bade her farewell. Indeed, I had no fear on her account. She was what people call a notable woman, and could manage matters in the world without my assistance. I believe, to tell the truth, she always looked upon me as an idle body, a mere make-weight, good for nothing but building castles in the air, and was rather glad to get rid of me. It was a dark night when I bade her good-bye, and talking with me as aides de camp, the 3 creditors who had given me so much trouble, we carried the balloon, with the car and accoutrements, by a roundabout way, to the station where the other articles were deposited. We found them all unmolested, and I proceeded immediately to business. It was the 1st of April. The night, as I said before, was dark, and there was not a star to be seen. A drizzling rain, falling at intervals, rendered us very uncomfortable, but my chief anxiety was concerning the balloon, which, in spite of the varnish with which it was defended, began to grow rather heavy with the moisture. The powder was also liable to damage. I therefore kept my 3 duns working with great diligence, pounding down ice around the central cask and stirring the acid in the others. They did not cease, however, importuning me with questions as to what I intended to do with all this apparatus, and expressed much dissatisfaction at the terrible labor I made them undergo. They could not perceive, so they said, what good was likely to result from getting wet to the skin, merely to take a part in such horrible incantations. I began to get uneasy, and worked away with all my might, for I verily believe the idiots supposed that I had entered into a compact with the devil, and that, in short, was what I was now doing, was nothing better than it should be. I was therefore in great fear of their leaving me altogether. I contrived, however, to pacify them by promises of payment of all scores in full as soon as I could bring the present business to a termination. To these speeches they gave, of course, their own interpretation, fancying, no doubt, that all events I should come into possession of vast quantities of ready money, and provided I paid them all I owed, and a trifle more in consideration of their services, I dare say they cared very little what became of either my soul or my carcass. In about 4 hours and a half, I found the balloon sufficiently inflated. I attached the car, therefore, and put all my implements in it, a telescope, a barometer, some important modifications, a thermometer, an electrometer, a compass, a magnetic needle, a seconds watch, a bell, a speaking trumpet, etc., 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 also a globe of glass, exhausted of air, and carefully closed with a stopper, not forgetting the considering apparatus, some unslacked lime, a stick of sealing wax, a copious supply of water, and a large quantity of provisions, such as permission, in which much nutriment is contained in comparatively little bulk. I also secured in the car a pair of pigeons and a cat. It was now nearly daybreak, and I thought it high time to take my departure. Dropping a lighted cigar on the ground, as if by accident, I took the opportunity, in stooping to pick it up, of igniting privately the piece of slow match, the end of which, as I said before, protruded a little beyond the lower rim of one of the smaller casks. This maneuver was totally unperceived on the part of the 3 duns, and, jumping into the car, I immediately cut the single cord which held me to the earth, and was pleased to find that I shot upward with inconceivable rapidity, carrying with all ease 175 pounds of leaden ballast, and able to have carried up as many more. As I left the earth, the barometer stood at 30 inches, and the centigrade thermometer at 19 degrees. Yes, he brought a pair of pigeons and a cat. Pigeons are apparently delicious. The cat, who knows, I've never had one. Scarcely, however, had I attained the height of 50 yards, when, roaring and rumbling up after me in the most tumultuous and terrible manner, came so dense a hurricane of fire and gravel and burning wood and blazing metal and mangled limbs that my very heart sunk within me, and I fell down in the bottom of the car, trembling with terror. Indeed, I now perceived that I had entirely overdone the business, and that the main consequences of the shock were yet to be experienced. Accordingly, in less than a second, I felt all the blood in my body rushing to my temples, and immediately thereupon a concussion, which I shall never forget, burst abruptly through the night, and seemed to rip the very firmament asunder. When I afterward had time for reflection, I did not fail to attribute the extreme violence of the explosion, as regarded myself, to its proper cause, my situation directly above it, and in the line of its greatest power. But at the time, I thought only of preserving my life. The balloon at first collapsed, then furiously expanded, then whirled round and round with sickening velocity, and finally, reeling and staggering like a drunken man, hurled me over the rim of the car and left me dangling at a terrific height, with my head downward and my face outward, by a piece of slender cord about 3 feet in length, which hung accidentally through a crevice near the bottom of the wickerwork, and in which, as I fell, my left foot became most providentially engaged. It is impossible, utterly impossible, to form any adequate idea of the horror of my situation. I gasped convulsively for breath. A shudder resembling a fit of the ague agitated every nerve and muscle in my frame. I felt my eyes starting from their sockets. A horrible nausea overwhelmed me, and at length I lost all consciousness in a swoon. How long I remained in this state, it is impossible to say. It must, however, have been no inconsiderable time, for when I partially recovered the sense of existence, I found the day breaking, the balloon at a prodigious height over a wilderness of ocean, and not a trace of land to be discovered far and wide within the limits of the vast horizon. My sensations, however, upon thus recovering, were by no means so replete with agony as might have been anticipated. Indeed, there was much of madness in the calm survey which I began to take of my situation. I drew up to my eyes each of my hands, one after the other, and wondered what occurrence could have given rise to the swelling of the veins and the horrible blackness of the fingernails. I afterward carefully examined my head, shaking it repeatedly and feeling it with minute attention, until I succeeded in satisfying myself that it was not, as I had more than half suspected, larger than my balloon. Then, in a knowing manner, I felt in both my breeches pockets and, missing therefrom, a set of tablets and a toothpick case, endeavored to account for their disappearance, and not being able to do so, felt inexpressibly chagrined. It now occurred to me that I suffered great uneasiness in the joint of my left ankle, and a dim consciousness of my situation began to glimmer through my mind. But, strange to say, I was neither astonished nor horror-stricken. If I felt any emotion at all, it was a kind of chuckling satisfaction at the cleverness I was about to display in extracting myself from this dilemma, and never, for a moment, did I look upon my ultimate safety as a question susceptible of doubt. For a few minutes I remained wrapped in the profoundest meditation. I have a distinct recollection of frequently compressing my lips, putting my forefinger to the side of my nose, and making use of other gesticulations and grimaces common to men who, at ease in their armchairs, meditate upon matters of intricacy or importance. Having, as I thought, sufficiently collected my ideas, I now, with great caution and deliberation, put my hands behind my back and unfastened the large iron buckle which belonged to the waistband of my pantaloons. This buckle had 3 teeth, which, being somewhat rusty, turned with great difficulty on their axis. I brought them, however, after some trouble, at right angles to the body of the buckle, and was glad to find them remain firm in that position. Holding within my teeth the instrument thus obtained, I now proceeded to untie the knot of my cravat. I had to rest several times before I could accomplish this maneuver, but it was at length accomplished. To one end of the cravat I then made fast the buckle, and the other end I tied, for greater security, tightly around my waist. Drawing now my body upward with a prodigious exertion of muscular force, I succeeded, at the very first trial, in throwing the buckle over the car and entangling it, as I had anticipated, in the circular rim of the wickerwork. My body was now inclined toward the side of the car, at an angle of about 45 degrees, but it must not be understood that I was therefore only 45 degrees below the perpendicular. So far from it, I still lay nearly level with the plane of the horizon, for the change of the situation which I had acquired had forced the bottom of the car considerably outward from my position, which was accordingly one of the most imminent peril. It should be remembered, however, that when I fell, in the first instance from the car, if I had fallen with my face turned toward the balloon instead of turned outwardly from it, as it actually was, or if, in the second place, the cord by which I was suspended had chanced to hang over the upper edge instead of through a crevice near the bottom of the car, I say it may readily be conceived that, in either of these supposed cases, I should have been unable to accomplish even as much as I had now accomplished, and the disclosures now made would have been utterly lost to posterity. I had therefore every reason to be grateful, although, in point of fact, I was still too stupid to be anything at all, and hung for perhaps a quarter of an hour in that extraordinary manner, without making the slightest farther exertion, and in a singularly tranquil state of idiotic enjoyment. But this feeling did not fail to die rapidly away, and thereunto succeeded horror and dismay, and a sense of utter helplessness and ruin. In fact, the blood so long accumulating in the vessels of my head and throat, and which had hitherto buoyed up my spirits with delirium, had now begun to retire within their proper channels, and the distinctness which was thus added to my perception of the danger merely served to deprive me of the self-possession and courage to encounter it. But this weakness was, luckily for me, of no very long duration. In good time came to my rescue the spirit of despair, and, with frantic cries and struggles, I jerked my way bodily upward, till at length, clutching with a vice-like grip the long-desired rim, I writhed my person over it, and fell headlong and shuddering within the car. It was not until some time afterward that I recovered myself sufficiently to attend to the ordinary cares of the balloon. I then, however, examined it with attention, and found it, to my great relief, uninjured. My implements were all safe, and, fortunately, I had lost neither ballast nor provisions. Indeed, I had so well secured them in their places that such an accident was entirely out of the question. Looking at my watch, I found it 6 o'clock. I was still rapidly ascending, and the barometer gave a present altitude of 3 3/4 miles. Immediately beneath me, in the ocean, lay a small black object, slightly oblong in shape, seemingly about the size of a domino, and in every respect bearing a great resemblance to one of these toys. bringing my telescope to bear upon it, I plainly discerned it to be a British 94-gun ship, close-hauled and pitching heavily in the sea, with her head to the west-southwest. Besides this ship, I saw nothing but the ocean and the sky and the sun, which had long arisen. It is now high time that I should explain to your excellencies the object of my voyage. Your excellencies will bear in mind that distressed circumstances in Rotterdam had at length driven me to the resolution of committing suicide. It was not, however, that to life itself I had any positive disgust. It was that I was harassed beyond endurances by the adventurous miseries attending my situation. In this state of mind, wishing to live, yet wearied with life, the treatise at the stall of the bookseller, backed by the opportune discovery of my cousin of Nantes, opened a resource to my imagination. I then finally made up my mind. I determined to depart, yet live, to leave the world, yet continue to exist. In short, to drop enigmas. I resolved, let what would ensue, to force a passage, if I could, to the moon. Now, lest I should be supposed more of a madman than I actually am, I will detail, as well as I am able, the considerations which led me to believe that an achievement of this nature, although without a doubt difficult and full of danger, was not absolutely, to a bold spirit, beyond the confines of the possible. The moon's actual distance from the earth was the first thing to be attended to. Now, the mean or average interval between the centers of the two planets is 59.9643 of the Earth's equatorial radii, or only about 237,000 miles. I say the mean or average interval, but it must be borne in mind that the form of the moon's orbit being an ellipse of eccentricity amounting to no less than 0.05484 of the major semi-axis of the ellipse itself, and the Earth's center being situated in its focus, if I could, in any manner, contrive to meet the moon in its pedigree, the above-mentioned distance would be materially diminished. But to say nothing at present of this possibility, it was very certain that, at all events, from the 237,000 miles I would have deduct the radius of the Earth, say 4,000, and the radius of the moon, say 1,080, in all 5,080, leaving an actual interval to be traversed under average circumstances of 231,920 miles. Now this, I reflected, was no very extraordinary distance. Traveling on the land has been repeatedly accomplished at the rate of 60 miles per hour, and indeed a much greater speed may be anticipated. But even at this velocity, it would take me to more than 161 days to reach the surface of the moon. There were, however, many particulars inducing me to believe that my average rate of traveling might possibly very much exceed that of 60 miles per hour, and, as these considerations did not fail to make a deep impression upon my mind, I will mention them more fully hereafter. One moment. The next point to be regarded was one of far greater importance. from indications afforded by the barometer, we find that in ascensions from the surface of the Earth, we have, at the height of 1,000 feet, left below us about 1/13 of the entire mass of atmospheric air. That is, at 10,600, we have ascended through nearly 1/3, and that at 18,000, which is not far from the elevation of Cotopaxi, we have surmounted 1/2 the material, or, at all events, 1/2 the ponderable body of air incumbent upon our globe. It is also calculated that at an altitude not exceeding the 100th part of the Earth's diameter, that is, not exceeding 80 miles, the refraction would be so excessive that animal life could in no manner be sustained, and moreover, that the most delicate means we possess of ascertaining the presence of the atmosphere would be inadequate to assure us of its existence. But I did not fail to perceive that these latter calculations are founded altogether on our experimental knowledge of the properties of air, and the mechanical laws regulating its dilation and compression in what may be called, comparatively speaking, the immediate vicinity of the Earth itself, and, at the same time, it is taken for granted that animal life is and must be essentially incapable of modification at any given unattainable distance from the surface. Now, all such reasoning and from such data must, of course, be simply analogical. The greatest height ever reached by man was that of 25,000 feet, attained in the aeronautic expedition of Messrs. Gay-Lussac and Bidault. This is a moderate altitude, even when compared with the 80 miles in question, and I could not help thinking that the subject admitted room for doubt and great latitude for speculation. But in point of fact, an ascension being made to any given altitude, the ponderable quantity of air surmounted in any farther ascension is by no means in proportion to the additional height ascended, as may be plainly seen from what has been stated before, but in a ratio constantly decreasing. It is therefore evident that, ascend as high as we may, we cannot, literally speaking, arrive at a limit beyond which no atmosphere is to be found. It must exist, I argued, although it may exist in a state of infinite rarefaction. On the other hand, I was aware that arguments have not been wanting to prove the existence of a real and definite limit to the atmosphere, beyond which there is absolutely no air whatsoever, but a circumstance which has been left out of view by those who contend for such a limit seemed to me, although no positive refutation of their creed, still a point worthy very serious investigation. On comparing the intervals between the successive arrivals of Encke's comet at its perihelion, after giving credit to the most exact manner for all the disturbances due to the attractions of the planets, it appears that the periods are gradually diminishing. That is to say, the major axis of the comet's ellipse is growing shorter, in a slow but perfectly regular decrease. Now, this is precisely what ought to be the case. If we suppose a resistance experienced from the comet from an extremely rare ethereal medium pervading the regions of its orbit, for it is evident that such a medium must, in retarding the comet's velocity, increase its centripetal by weakening its centrifugal force. In other words, the sun's attraction would be constantly attaining greater power, and the comet would be drawn nearer at every revolution. Indeed, there is no other way of accounting for the variation in question. But again, the real diameter of the same comet's nebulosity is observed to contract rapidly as it approaches the sun, and dilate with equal rapidity in its departure towards its aphelion. Was I not justifiable in supposing, with Miss M. Velez, that this apparent consideration of volume has its origin in the compression of the same ethereal medium I have spoken of before, and which is dense in proportion to its vicinity to the sun? The lenticular-shaped phenomenon, also called the zodiacal light, was a matter worthy of attention. This radiance, so apparent in the tropics, and which cannot be mistaken for any meteoric luster, extends from the horizon obliquely upward, and follows generally the direction of the sun's equator. It appeared to me evidently in the nature of a rare atmosphere extending from the sun outward, beyond the orbit of Venus at least, and I believed indefinitely further. Indeed, this medium I could not suppose confined to the path of the comet's ellipse, or to the immediate neighborhood of the sun. It was easy, on the contrary, to imagine it pervading the entire regions of our planetary system, condensed into what we call atmosphere at the planets themselves, and perhaps at some of them modified by considerations purely geological, that is to say, modified or varied in its proportions or absolute nature by matters violated from the respective orbs. Thanks, I like smiling when I read. I'm glad you like it. Having adopted this view of the subject, I had little farther hesitation, granting that on my passage I should meet with atmosphere essentially the same as at the surface of the earth. I conceived that, by means of the very ingenious apparatus of M. Grimm, I should readily be enabled to condense it in sufficient quantity for the purpose of respiration. This would remove the chief obstacle in the journey to the moon. I had indeed spent some money and great labor in adapting the apparatus to the object intended, and confidently looked forward to its successful application. If I could manage to complete the voyage within any reasonable period, this brings me back to the rate at which it would be possible to travel. It is true that balloons, in the first stage of their ascensions from the earth, are known to rise with a velocity comparatively moderate. Now, the power of elevation lies altogether in the superior gravity of the atmospheric air compared with the gas in the balloon, and, at first sight, it does not appear probable that as the balloon acquires altitude, and consequently arrives successfully in atmospheric strata of densities rapidly diminishing, I say it does not appear at all reasonable that, in its progress upward, the original velocity should be accelerated. On the other hand, I was not aware that, in any recorded ascension, a diminution had been proved to be apparent in the absolute rate of ascent, although such should have been the case, if, on account of nothing else, on account of the escape of gas through the balloons ill-constructed and varnished with no better material than the ordinary varnish. It seemed, therefore, that the effect of such escape was only sufficient to counterbalance the effect of the acceleration attained in the diminishing the balloon's distance from the gravitating center. I now considered that, provided in my passage I found the medium I had imagined, and provided that it should prove to be essentially what we demonstrate atmospheric air, what we denominate atmospheric air, it could be made comparatively little difference at what extreme state of rarefication I should discover it. That is to say, in regard to my power of ascending, for the gas in the balloon would not only be itself subject to similar rarefaction, in proportion the occurrence of which I could suffer an escape of so much as would be requisite to prevent explosion, but, being what it was, would at all events continue specifically lighter than any compound whatever of mere nitrogen and oxygen. Thus, there was a chance, in fact, there was... Sorry, I lost my place there for a second as I shifted. There was a chance, in fact, there was a strong possibility that, at no epoch of my ascent, should I reach a point where the united weights of my immense balloon, the inconceivably rare gas within it, the car and its contents, should equal the weight of the mass of the surrounding atmosphere displaced. And this will be readily understood as the sole condition upon which my upward flight would be arrested. But if this point were ever attained, I could dispense with ballast and other weight to the amount of nearly 300 pounds. In the meantime, the force of gravitation would be constantly diminishing, in proportion to the squares of the distances, and so, with a velocity prodigiously accelerating, I should at length arrive in those distant regions where the force of the Earth's attraction be superseded by that of the moon. There was another difficulty, however, which occasioned me some little disquietude. It has been observed that in balloon ascensions to any considerable height, besides the pain attending respiration, great uneasiness is experienced about the head and body, often accompanied with bleeding at the nose, and other symptoms of an alarming kind, and growing more and more inconvenient in proportion to the altitude attained. This was a reflection of a nature somewhat startling. Was it not possible that these symptoms would increase until terminated by death itself? I finally thought not. Their origin was to be looked for in the progressive removal of the customary atmospheric pressure upon the surface of the body, the consequent dissension of the superficial blood vessels, not in any positive disorganization of the animal system, as in the case of difficulty in breathing, where the atmospheric density is chemically insufficient for the due renovation of blood in a ventricle of the heart. Unless for default of this renovation, I could see no reason, therefore, why life could not be sustained even in a vacuum. For the expansion and compression of chest, commonly called breathing, is actually purely muscular, and the cause, not the effect, of respiration. In a word, I conceived that, as the body should become habituated to the want of atmospheric pressure, the sensations of pain would gradually diminish, and to endure them while they continued, I relied with confidence upon the iron hardihood of my constitution. Thus it may please your excellencies, I have detailed some, though by no means all, considerations which led me to form the project of a lunar voyage, I shall now proceed to lay before you the result of an attempt so apparently audacious in conception, and, at all events, so utterly unparalleled in the annals of mankind. Having attained the altitude before mentioned, that is to say 3 miles and 3/4, I threw out from the car a quantity of feathers, and found that I still ascended with sufficient rapidity. There was, therefore, no necessity for discharging any ballast. I was glad of this, for I wished to retain with me as much weight as I could carry, for the obvious reason that I could not be positive either about the gravitation or atmospheric density of the moon. I as yet suffered no bodily inconvenience, breathing with great freedom, and feeling no pain whatever in the head. The cat was lying very demurely upon my coat, which I had taken off, and eyeing the pigeons with an air of nonchalance. These later, being tied by the leg to prevent their escape, were busily employed in picking up some grains of rice scattered for them in the bottom of the car, as cats are wont to do. Stare at birds until they get close enough. At 20 minutes past 6 o'clock, the barometer showed an elevation of 26,400 feet, or 5 miles to a fraction. Prospect seemed unbounded, indeed. It is very easily calculated by means of spherical geometry how great an extent of the earth's area I beheld. The convex surface of any segment of a sphere is to the entire surface of the sphere itself, as the versed sine of the segment to the diameter of the sphere. Now, in my case, the versed sine, that is to say, the thickness of the segment beneath me, was about equal to my elevation, or the elevation of the point of sight above the surface. As 5 miles, then, to 8,000 would express the proportion of the earth's area seen by me. In other words, I beheld as much as a 1/1600th part of the whole surface of the globe. The sea appeared unruffled as a mirror, although by means of the telescope I could perceive it to be in a state of violent agitation. The ship was no longer visible, having drifted away, apparently to the eastward. I now began to experience, at intervals, severe pain in the head, especially about the ears. Still, however, breathing with tolerable freedom, the cat and pigeons seemed to suffer no inconvenience whatsoever. At 20 minutes before 7, the balloon entered a long series of dense cloud, which put me to great trouble by damaging my condensing apparatus and wetting me to the skin. This was, to be sure, a singular rencontre, for I had not believed it possible that a cloud of this nature could be sustained at so great an elevation. I thought it best, however, to throw out 2 5-pound pieces of ballast, reserving still a weight of 165 pounds. Upon so doing, I soon rose above the difficulty, and perceived immediately that I had obtained a great increase in my rate of ascent. In a few seconds after my leaving the cloud, a flash of vivid lightning shot from one end of it to the other, and caused it to kindle up throughout its vast extent like a mass of ignited charcoal. This, it must be remembered, was in the broad light of day. No fancy may picture the sublimity which might have been exhibited by a similar phenomenon taking place amid the darkness of the night. Hell itself might have been found a fitting image. Even as it was, my hair stood on end, while I gazed afar down strange vaulted halls. While I gazed afar down within the yawning abysses, letting imagination descend and stalk about in the strange vaulted halls and ruddy gulfs and red ghastly chasms of the hideous and unfathomable fire. I had indeed made a narrow escape, had the balloon remained a very short while longer within the cloud, that is to say, had not the inconvenience of getting wet determined me to discharge the ballast, my destruction might, and possibly would, have been the consequence. Such perils, although little considered, are perhaps the greatest which must be encountered in balloons. I had by this time attained too great an elevation to be any longer uneasy on the head. I was now rising rapidly, and by 7 o'clock the barometer indicated an altitude of no less than 9 miles and a half. I began to find great difficulty in drawing my breath. My head, too, was excessively painful, and having felt for some time a moisture about my cheeks, I at length discovered it to be blood, which was oozing quite fast from the drums of my ears. My eyes also gave me great uneasiness. Upon passing the hand over them, they seemed to have protruded from their sockets in no inconsiderable degree, and all objects in the car, and even the balloon itself, appeared distorted to my vision. These symptoms were more than I had expected, and occasioned me some alarm. At this juncture, very imprudently and without consideration, I threw out from the car 3 5-pound pieces of ballast. The accelerated rate of ascent thus obtained carried me too rapidly and without sufficient gradation into a highly rarefied stratum of the atmosphere, and the result had nearly proved fatal to my expedition and to myself. I was suddenly seized with a spasm which lasted for more than 5 minutes, and even when this, in a measure, ceased, I could catch my breath only at long intervals and in a gasping manner, bleeding all the while copiously at the nose and ears, and even slightly at the eyes. The pigeons appeared distressed in the extreme, and struggled to escape, while the cat mewed piteously and, their tongue hanging out of her mouth, staggered to and fro in the car, as if under the influence of poison. I now too late discovered the great rashness of which I had been guilty in discharging the ballast, and my agitation was excessive. I anticipated nothing less than death, and death in a few minutes. The physical suffering I underwent contributed also to render me nearly incapable of making any exertion for the preservation of my life. I had, indeed, little power of reflection left, and the violence of the pain in my head seemed to be greatly on the increase. Thus I found that my senses would shortly give way altogether, and I had already clutched one of the valve ropes, the view of attempting a descent. With the recollection of the trick I had played 3 creditors, and the possible consequences to myself, I should return, operated to deter me for the moment. I lay down in the bottom of the car and endeavored to collect my faculties. In this I so far succeeded as to determine upon the experiment of losing blood. Having no lancet, however, I was constrained to perform the operation in the best manner I was able, and finally succeeded in opening a vein in my left arm with the blade of my penknife. The blood had hardly commenced flowing when I experienced a sensible relief, and by the time I had lost about half a moderate basinful, most of the worst symptoms had abandoned me entirely. I nevertheless did not think it expedient to attempt getting on my feet immediately, but, having tied up my arm as well as I could, I lay still for about a quarter of an hour. At the end of this time I arose and found myself freer from absolute pain of any kind than I had been during the last hour and a quarter of my ascension. The difficulty of breathing, however, was diminished in a very slight degree, and I found that it would soon be positively necessary to make use of my condenser. In the meantime, looking toward the cat, who was again snugly stowed away upon my coat, I discovered, to my infinite surprise, that she had taken the opportunity of my indisposition to bring into light a litter of 3 little kittens. This was an addition to the number of passengers on my part altogether unexpected, but I was pleased at the occurrence. It would afford me a chance of bringing to a kind of test the truth of a surmise, which, more than anything else, had influenced me in attempting this ascension. I had imagined that the habitual endurance of the atmospheric pressure at the surface of the earth was the cause, or nearly so, of the pain attending animal existence at a distance above the surface. Should the kittens be found to suffer uneasiness in an equal degree with their mother, I must consider my theory in fault, but a failure to do so I should look upon as a strong confirmation of my idea. By 8 o'clock, I had actually attained the elevation of 17 miles above the surface of the earth. Thus it seemed to me evident that my rate of ascent was not only on the increase, but that the progression would have been apparent in a slight degree even had I not discharged the ballast which I did. The pains in my head and ears returned at intervals with violence, and I still continued to bleed occasionally at the nose. But, upon the whole, I suffered much less than might have been expected. I breathed, however, at every moment with more and more difficulty, and each inhalation was attended with a troublesome spasmodic action of the chest. I now unpacked the condensing apparatus and got it ready for immediate use. The view of the earth at this period of my ascension was beautiful indeed. To the westward, the northward, and the southward, as far as I could see, lay a boundless sheet of apparently unruffled ocean, with every moment gained a deeper and deeper tint of blue. At a vast distance to the eastward, although perfectly discernible, extended the islands of Great Britain, the entire Atlantic coasts of France and Spain, with a small portion of the northern part of the continent of Africa. Of individual edifices, not a trace could be discovered, and the proudest cities of mankind had utterly faded away from the face of the earth. What mainly astonished me in the appearance of things below was the seeming concavity of the surface of the globe. I had, thoughtlessly enough, expected to see its real convexity become evident as I ascended, but a very little reflection sufficed to explain the discrepancy. A line dropped from my position perpendicularly to the earth would have formed the perpendicular of a right-angled triangle, of which the base would have extended from the right angle to the horizon. and the hypotenuse from the horizon to my position, but my height was little or nothing in comparison with my prospect. In other words, the base and hypotenuse of the supposed triangle would, in my case, have been so long when compared to the perpendicular that the two former might have been regarded as nearly parallel. In this manner, the horizon of the aeronaut appears always to be upon a level with the car. But as the point immediately beneath him seems, and is, at a great distance below him, it seems, of course, also at great distance below the horizon. Hence the impression of concavity, and this impression must remain until the elevation shall bear so great a proportion to the prospect that the apparent parallelism of the base and hypotenuse disappears. The pigeons, about this time, seeming to undergo much suffering, I determined upon giving them their liberty. I first untied one of them, a beautiful grey mottled pigeon, and placed him upon the rim of the wicker-work. He appeared extremely uneasy, looking anxiously about him, fluttering his wings, and making a loud cooing noise. Could not be persuaded to trust himself from the car. I took him up at last and threw him to about 6 yards from the balloon. He made, however, no attempt to descend as I had expected, but struggled with great vehemence to get back, uttering at the same time very shrill and piercing cries. He at length succeeded in regaining his former station on the rim, but had hardly done so when his head dropped upon his breast, and he fell dead within the car. The other one did not prove so unfortunate, to prevent his following the example of his companion and accomplishing a return. I threw him downward with all my force, and was pleased to find him continue his descent with great velocity, making use of his wings with ease, and in a perfectly natural manner. In a very short time he was out of sight, and I have no doubt he reached home in safety. Puss, who seemed in a great measure recovered from her illness, now made hearty meal of the dead bird, and then went to sleep with much apparent satisfaction. Her kittens were lively, and so far evinced not the slightest sign of any uneasiness. At 8:15, being able no longer to draw breath without the most intolerable pain, I proceeded forthwith to adjust around the car the apparatus belonging to the condenser. This apparatus will require some little explanation, and your excellencies will please to bear in mind that my object, in the first place, was to surround myself and car entirely with a barricade against the highly rarefied atmosphere in which I was existing, with the intention of introducing within this barricade, by means of my condenser, a quantity of the same atmosphere sufficiently condensed for the purposes of respiration. With this object in view, I had prepared a very long, perfectly airtight, but flexible gum-elastic bag. In this bag, which was of sufficient dimensions, the entire car was in a manner placed. That is to say, the bag, was drawn over the whole bottom of the car, up its sides, and so on along the outside of the ropes to the upper rim or hoop, where the network is attached. Having pulled the bag up in this way, and formed a complete enclosure on all sides and at the bottom, it was now necessary to fasten up its top or mouth by passing its material over the hoop of the network. In other words, between the network and the hoop. But if the network were separated from the hoop to admit this passage, what was to sustain the car in the meantime. Now the network was not permanently fastened to the hoop, but attached by a series of running loops or nooses. I therefore undid only a few of these loops at one time, leaving the car suspended by the remainder. Having thus inserted a portion of the cloth forming the upper part of the bag, I refastened the loops, not to the hoop, for that would have been impossible, since the cloth now intervened, but to a series of large buttons affixed to the cloth itself, about 3 feet below the mouth of the bag. The intervals between the buttons having been made to correspond to the intervals between the loops. This done, a few more of the loops were unfastened from the rim, a farther portion of the cloth introduced, and the disengaged loops then connected with the proper buttons. In this way, it was possible to insert the whole upper part of the bag between the network and the hoop. It is evident that the hoop would now drop down within the car, while the whole weight of the car itself, with all its contents, would be held up merely by the strength of the buttons. This, at first sight, would seem an inadequate dependence, but it was by no means so, for the buttons were not only very strong in themselves, but so close together that a very slight portion of the whole weight was supported by any one of them. Indeed, I had the car and contents being 3 times heavier than they were, I should not have been at all uneasy. I now raised up the hoop again within the covering of gum elastic, and propped it at nearly its former height by means of 3 light poles prepared for the occasion. This was done, of course, to keep the bag distended at the top and to preserve the lower part of the network in its proper situation. All that now remained was to fasten up the mouth of the enclosure, and this was readily accomplished by gathering the folds of the material together and twisting them up very tightly on the inside by means of a kind of stationary tourniquet. In the sides of the covering, thus adjusted around the car, had been inserted 3 circular panes of thick but clear glass, through which I could see without difficulty around me in every horizontal direction. In that portion of the cloth forming the bottom was likewise a 4th window, the same kind and corresponding with a small aperture in the floor of the car itself. This enabled me to see perpendicularly down, but having found it impossible to place any similar contrivance overhead on account of the particular manner of closing up the opening there, and the consequent wrinkles in the cloth, I could expect to see no object situated directly in my zenith. This, of course, was a matter of little consequence, for, had I even been able to place a window at the top, the balloon itself would have prevented my making any use of it. About a foot below one of the side windows was a circular opening, 3 inches in diameter, and fitted with a brass rim adapted in its inner edge to the windings of a screw. In this rim was screwed the large tube of the condenser, the body of the machine being, of course, within the chamber of gum elastic. Though this tube of a quantity of the rare atmosphere circumjacent being drawn by means of a vacuum created in the body of the machine, was thence discharged in a state of condensation, to mingle with the thin air already in the chamber. This operation, being repeated several times, at length filled the chamber with atmosphere proper for all the purposes of respiration. But in so confined a space it would, in a short time, necessarily become foul and unfit for use from frequent contact with the lungs. It was then ejected by a small valve at the bottom of the car, dense air readily sinking into the thinner atmosphere below. To avoid the inconvenience of making a total vacuum at any moment within the chamber, this purification was never accomplished all at once, but in a gradual manner, the valve being opened only for a few seconds, then closed again until 1 or 2 strokes from the pump of the condenser had supplied the place of the atmosphere ejected. For the sake of experiment, I had put the cat and kittens in a small basket and suspended it outside the car to a button at the bottom, close by the valve, through which I could feed them at any moment when necessary. I did this at some little risk, and before closing the mouth of the chamber by reaching under the car with one of the poles before mentioned to which a hook had been attached. As soon as dense air was admitted in the chamber, the hoop and poles became unnecessary, the expansion of the enclosed atmosphere powerfully distending the gum elastic. By the time I had fully completed the arrangements and filled the chamber as expected, it wanted only 10 minutes of 9 o'clock. During the whole period of my being thus employed, I endured the most terrible distress from difficulty of respiration, and bitterly did I repent the negligence, or rather foolhardiness, of which I had been guilty, of putting off to the last moment a matter of so much importance. But having at length accomplished it, I soon began to reap the benefit of my invention. Once again I breathed with perfect freedom and ease, and indeed why should I not? I was also agreeably surprised to find myself, in a great measure, relieved from the violent pains which had hitherto tormented me. A slight headache, accompanied with a sensation of fullness or distension about the wrists, the ankles, and the throat, was nearly all of which I had now to complain. Thus it seemed evident that a greater part of the uneasiness attending the removal of atmospheric pressure had actually worn off, as I had expected, and that much of the pain endured for the last 2 hours should have been attributed altogether to the effects of a deficient respiration. At 20 minutes before 9 o'clock, that is to say, a short time prior to my closing of the mouth of the chamber, the mercury attained its limit, or ran down in the barometer, which, as I mentioned before, was one of an extended construction. It then indicated an altitude on my part of 132,000 feet, or 25 miles, and I consequently surveyed at that time an extent of the Earth's area amounting to no less than 320th part of its entire superficies. At 9 o'clock, I had again lost sight of land to the eastward, but not before I became aware that the balloon was drifting rapidly to the north-northwest. The ocean beneath me still retained its apparent concavity, although my view was often interrupted by the masses of cloud which floated to and fro. At 9:30, I tried the experiment of throwing out a handful of feathers through the valve. They did not float as I had expected, but dropped down perpendicularly like a bullet en masse and with the greatest velocity, being out of sight in a very few seconds. I did not know at first I did not at first know what to make of this extraordinary phenomenon, not being able to believe that my rate of ascent had, of a sudden, met with so prodigious an acceleration. But it soon occurred to me that the atmosphere was now far too rare to sustain even the feathers, that they actually fell, as they appeared to do, with great rapidity, and that I had been surprised by the united velocities of their descent and my own elevation. By 10 o'clock I found that I had very little to occupy my immediate attention. Affairs went on swimmingly, and I believed the balloon to be going upward with a speed increasing momently. Although I had no longer any means of ascertaining the progression of the increase, I suffered no pain or uneasiness of any kind, and enjoyed better spirits than I had at any period since my departure from Rotterdam. Busying myself now in examining the state of my various apparatus, and now in regenerating the atmosphere within the chamber. This latter point I determined to attend to at regular intervals of 40 minutes, more on account of the preservation of my health than from so frequent a renovation being absolutely necessary. In the meanwhile, I could not help making anticipations. Fancy reveled in the wild and dreamy regions of the moon. Imagination, feeling herself for once unshackled, roamed at will among the ever-changing wonders of a shadowy and unstable land. Now there were hoary and time-honored forests, and craggy precipices, and waterfalls tumbling with a loud noise into abysses without a bottom. Then I came suddenly into still noonday solitudes, where no wind of heaven ever intruded, and where vast meadows of poppies, the slender, lily-looking flowers, spread themselves out a weary distance, all silent and motionless forever. Then again I journeyed far down away into another country, where it was all one dim and vague lake, with a boundary line of clouds. But fancies such as these were not the sole possessors of my brain. Horrors of a nature most stern and most appalling would too frequently obtrude themselves upon my mind, and shake the innermost depths of my soul with the bare supposition of their possibility. Yet I would not suffer my thoughts for any length of time to dwell upon these latter speculations, rightly judging the real and palpable dangers of the voyage sufficient for my undivided attention. At 5 o'clock p.m., being engaged in regenerating the atmosphere within the chamber, I took that opportunity of observing the cat and kittens through the valve. The cat herself appeared to suffer again very much, and I had no hesitation in attributing her uneasiness chiefly to a difficulty in breathing, but my experiment with the kittens had resulted very strangely. I had expected, of course, to see them betray a sense of pain, although in a less degree than their mother, and this would have been sufficient to confirm my opinion concerning the habitual endurance of atmospheric pressure. But I was not prepared to find them, upon close examination, evidently enjoying a high degree of health, breathing with the greatest ease and perfect regularity, and evincing not the slightest sign of any uneasiness. I could only account for all of this by extending my theory, and supposing that the highly rarefied atmosphere around might perhaps not be, as I had taken for granted, chemically insufficient for the purposes of life, and that a person born in such a medium might possibly be unaware of any inconvenience attending its inhalation. while, upon removal to the denser strata near the earth, he might endure tortures of a similar nature to those I had so lately experienced. It has since been to me a matter of deep regret that an awkward accident at this time occasioned me the loss of my little family of cats, and deprived me of the insight into this matter which continued experiment might have afforded. In passing my hand through the valve for the cup of water for the old puss, the sleeve of my shirt became entangled in the loop which sustained the basket, and thus, in a moment, loosened it from the button. Had the whole actually vanished to air, it could not have shot from my sight in more abrupt and instantaneous manner. Positively, there could not have intervened the 10th part of a second between the disengagement of the basket and its absolute disappearance with all that it contained. My good wishes followed it to the earth, but of course I had no hope that either cat or kittens would ever live to tell the tale of their misfortune. At 6 o'clock I perceived a great portion of the earth's visible area to the eastward, involved in thick shadow, which continued to advance with great rapidity until, at 5 minutes before 7, the whole surface in view was enveloped in darkness of night. It was not, however, until long after this time that the rays of the setting sun ceased to illuminate the balloon, and this circumstance, although of course fully anticipated, did not fail to give me an infinite deal of pleasure. It was evident that, in the morning, I should behold the rising luminary many hours at least before the citizens of Rotterdam, in spite of their situation so much further to the eastward, and thus, day after day, in proportion to the height ascended, I would enjoy the light of the sun for a longer period. I now determined to keep a journal of my passage, reckoning the days from 1 to 24 hours continuously, without taking into consideration the intervals of darkness. At 10 o'clock, feeling sleepy, I determined to lie down for the rest of the night. But here a difficulty presented itself, which, obvious as it may appear, had escaped my attention up to the very moment of which I am now speaking. If I went to sleep as I proposed, how could the atmosphere in the chamber be regenerated in the interim? To breathe it for more than an hour at the farthest would be a matter of impossibility, or, if even this term could be extended to an hour and a quarter, the most ruinous consequences might ensue. The consideration of this dilemma gave me no little disquietude, and it will hardly be believed that after the dangers I had undergone, I should look upon this business in so serious a light as to give up all hope of accomplishing my ultimate design, and finally make up my mind to the necessity of a descent. But this hesitation was only momentary. I reflected that man is the veriest slave of custom, and that many points in the routine of his existence are deemed essentially important, which are only so at all by his having rendered them habitual. It was very certain that I could not do without sleep, but I might easily bring myself to feel no inconvenience from being awakened at intervals of an hour during the whole period of my repose. It would require but 5 minutes at most to regenerate the atmosphere in the fullest manner, and the only real difficulty was to contrive a method of arousing myself at the proper moment for doing so. but this was a question which, I am willing to confess, occasioned me no little trouble in its solution. To be sure, I had heard of the student who, to prevent his falling asleep over his books, held in one hand a ball of copper, the din of whose descent to a basin of the same metal on the floor beside his chair served effectually to startle him up, if at any moment he should be overcome with drowsiness. My own case, however, was very different indeed, and left me no room for any similar idea, for I did not wish to keep awake, but to be aroused from a slumber at regular intervals of time. I at length hit upon the following expedient, which, simple as it may seem, was hailed by me at the moment of discovery as an invention fully equal to that of the telescope, the steam engine, or the art of printing itself. It is necessary to premise that the balloon, at the elevation now attained, continued its course upward with an even and undeviating ascent, and the car consequently followed with a steadfastness so perfect that it would have been impossible to detect in it the slightest vacillation. This circumstance favored me greatly in the prospect I now determined to adopt. My supply of water had been put on board in kegs containing 5 gallons each, and ranged very securely around the interior of the car. I unfastened one of these, and taking 2 ropes, tied them tightly across the rim of the wicker work from one side to the other, placing them about a foot apart and parallel, so as to form a kind of shelf, upon which I placed the keg and steadied it in a horizontal position. About 8 inches immediately below these ropes, and 4 feet from the bottom of the car, I fastened another shelf, but made of thin plank, being the only similar piece of wood I had. Upon this latter shelf, and exactly beneath one of the rims of the keg, a small earthen pitcher was deposited. I now bored a hole in the end of the keg over the pitcher, and fitted in a plug of soft wood, cut in a tapering or conical shape. This plug I pushed in or pulled out as might happen, until, after a few experiments, it arrived at the exact degree of tightness, to which the water oozing from the hole and falling into the pitcher below would fill the latter to the brim in the period of 60 minutes. This, of course, was a matter briefly and easily ascertained by noticing the portion of the pitcher filled in any given time. Having arranged all this, the rest of the plan is obvious. My bed was so contrived upon the floor of the car as to bring my head, in lying down, immediately below the mouth of the pitcher. It was evident that, at the experimentation of an hour, the pitcher, getting full, would be forced to turn over, and to run over at the mouth, which was somewhat lower than the rim. It was also evident that the water, thus falling from a height of more than 4 feet, could not do otherwise than fall upon my face, and that the sure consequence would be to waken me up instantaneously, even from the soundest slumber in the world. It was fully 11 by the time I had completed these arrangements, and I immediately betook myself to bed, with a full confidence in the efficiency of my invention. Nor in this matter was I disappointed. Punctually, every 60 minutes, I was aroused by my trusty chronometer. when, having emptied the pitcher into the bunghole of the keg and performed the duties of the condenser, I retired again to bed. These regular interruptions to my slumber caused me even less discomfort than I had anticipated, and when I finally arose for the day, it was 7 o'clock, and the sun had attained many degrees above the line of the horizon. April 3rd. I found the balloon at an immense height indeed, and the Earth's convexity had now become strikingly manifest. Below me in the ocean lay a cluster of black specks, which undoubtedly were islands. Overhead, the sky was of a jetty black, and the stars were brilliantly visible. Indeed, they had been so constantly since the first day of the ascent. Far away to the northward, I perceived a thin, white, and exceedingly brilliant line or streak on the edge of the horizon, and I had no hesitation in supposing it to be the southern disk of the ices of the polar sea. My curiosity was greatly excited, for I had hopes of passing on much further to the north, and might possibly, at some period, find myself placed directly above the pole itself. I now lamented that my great elevation would, in this case, prevent my taking as accurate a survey as I could wish. Much, however, might be. Nothing else of an extraordinary nature occurred during the day. My apparatus all continued in good order, and the balloon still ascended without any perceptible vacillation. The cold was intense, and obliged me to wrap up closely in an overcoat. When darkness came over the earth, I betook myself to bed. Although it was for many hours afterward broad daylight all around my immediate situation, the water clock was punctual in its duty, and I slept until next morning soundly, with the exception of the periodical interruption. April 4th. Arose in good health and spirits, and was astonished at the singular change which had taken place in the appearance of the sea. It had lost, in a great measure, the deep tint of blue it had hitherto worn, being now a grayish white, and of a lustre dazzling to the eye. The convexity of the ocean had become so evident that the entire mass of the distant water seemed to be tumbling headlong over the abyss of the horizon, and I found myself listening on tiptoe for the echoes of the mighty cataract. The islands were no longer visible. Whether they had passed down the horizon to the southeast, or whether my increasing elevation had left them out of sight, it is impossible to say. I was inclined, however, to the latter opinion. The rim of ice to the northward was growing more and more apparent. Cold by no means intense, nothing of importance occurred, and I passed the day in reading, having taken care to supply myself with books. April 5th. Beheld the singular phenomenon of the sun rising while nearly the whole visible surface of the earth continued to be involved in darkness. In time, however, the light spread itself over all, and I again saw the line of ice to the northward. It was now very distinct, and appeared of a much darker hue than the waters of the ocean. I was evidently approaching it, and with great rapidity. fancied I could again distinguish a strip of land to the eastward, and one also to the westward, but I could not be certain. Weather moderate, nothing of any consequence happened during the day. Went early to bed. April 6th. Was surprised at finding the rim of ice at a very moderate distance, and an immense field of the same material stretching away off to the horizon in the north. It was evident that if the balloon held its present course, it would soon arrive above the frozen ocean, and I had now little doubt of ultimately seeing the pole. During the whole of the day, I continued to near the ice. Toward night, the limits of my horizon very suddenly and materially increased, owing undoubtedly to the Earth's form being that of an oblate spheroid, and my arriving above the flattened regions in the vicinity of the Arctic Circle. When darkness at length overtook me, I went to bed in great anxiety, fearing to pass over the object of so much curiosity, and I should have no opportunity of observing it. April 7th. Arose early, and, to my great joy, at length beheld what there could be no hesitation in supposing the northern pole itself. It was there, beyond a doubt, and immediately beneath my feet, but alas, I had now ascended to so vast a distance that nothing could with accuracy be discerned. Indeed, to judge from the progression of the numbers indicating my various altitudes, respectively, at different periods, between 6 a.m. on the 2nd of April and 20 minutes before 9 a.m., the same day, at which time the barometer ran down, it might be fairly inferred that the balloon had now, at 4 o'clock in the morning of April the 7th, reached a height of not less, certainly, than 7,254 miles above the surface of the sea. This elevation may appear immense, but the estimate upon which it is calculated gave a result, in all probability, far inferior to the truth. At all events, I undoubtedly beheld the whole of the Earth's major diameter. The entire northern hemisphere lay beneath me like a chart orthographically projected, and the great circle of the equator itself formed the boundary line of my horizon. Your Excellencies may, however, readily imagine that the confined regions hitherto unexplored within the limits of the Arctic Circle, although situated directly beneath me, and therefore seen without any appearance of being foreshortened, were still, in themselves, comparatively too diminutive, and at too great a distance from the point of sight to admit of any very accurate examination. Nevertheless, what could be seen was of a nature singular and exciting. Northwardly, from that huge rim before mentioned, and which, with slight qualification, may be called the limit of human discovery in these regions, once unbroken, or nearly unbroken, sheet of ice continues to extend. In the first few degrees of this progress, its surface is very sensibly flattened, farther on depressed into a plane, and finally becoming not a little concave. It terminates at the pole itself in a circular center, sharply defined, whose apparent diameter is subtended at the balloon at an angle of about 65 seconds, and whose dusky hue, varying in intensity, was, at all times, darker than any other spot upon the visible hemisphere, and occasionally deepened into the most absolute blackness. Farther than this, little could be ascertained. By 12 o'clock, The circular center had materially decreased in circumference, and by 7 p.m. I lost sight of it entirely. The balloon passing over the western limb of the ice and floating away rapidly in the direction of the equator. April 8th. Found a sensible diminution in the Earth's apparent diameter. Besides a material alteration in its general color and appearance, the whole visible area partook in different degrees of a tint of pale yellow, and in some portions had acquired a brilliancy even painful to the eye. My view downward was also considerably impeded by the dense atmosphere in the vicinity of the surface being loaded with clouds, between whose masses I could only now and then obtain a glimpse of the earth itself. This difficulty of direct vision had troubled me more or less for the last 48 hours. My present enormous elevation brought closer together, as it were, the floating bodies of vapor, and the inconvenience became, of course, more and more palpable in proportion to my ascent. Nevertheless, I could easily perceive that the balloon now hovered above the range of great lakes in the continent of North America, and was holding a course due south, which would bring me to the tropics. This circumstance did not fail to give me the most heartfelt satisfaction, and I hailed it as a happy omen of ultimate success. Indeed, the direction I had hitherto taken had filled me with uneasiness, for it was evident that, had I continued it much longer, there would have been no possibility of my arriving at the moon at all, whose orbit is inclined to be to the elliptic at only the small angle of 5 hours, 8 minutes, 48 seconds. Strange as it may seem, it was only at this late period that I began to understand the great error I had committed in not taking my departure from Earth at some point in the plane of the lunar eclipse. Ellipse, not eclipse. April 9th. Today, the Earth's diameter was greatly diminished, and the color of the surface assumed hourly a deeper tint of yellow. The balloon kept steadily on her course to the southward and arrived at 9 p.m. over the northern edge of the Mexican Gulf. April 10th. I was suddenly aroused from slumber about 5 o'clock this morning by a loud crackling and terrific sound for which I could in no manner account. It was of very brief duration, but while it lasted, resembled nothing in the world of which I had any previous experience. It is needless to say that I became excessively alarmed, having, in the first instance, attributed the noise to the bursting of the balloon. I examined all my apparatus, however, with great attention, and could discover nothing out of the order. Spent a great part of the day in meditating upon an occurrence so extraordinary, but could find no means whatever of accounting for it. Went to bed dissatisfied, in a state of great anxiety and agitation. April 11th. Found a startling diminution in the apparent diameter of the Earth, and a considerable increase, now observable for the first time, in that of the moon itself, which waned only a few days of being full. It now required long and excessive labor to condense within the chamber sufficient atmospheric air for the sustenance of life. April 12th. A singular alteration took place in regard to the direction of the balloon, and although fully anticipated, afforded me the most unequivocal delight. Having reached, in its former course, about the 20th parallel of southern latitude, it turned off suddenly at an acute angle to the eastward, and thus proceeded throughout the day, keeping nearly, if not altogether, in the exact plane of the lunar ellipse. What was worthy of remark, a very perceptible vacillation in the car was a consequence of this change of route. A vacillation which prevailed in a more or less degree for a period of many hours. April 13th. Was again very much alarmed by the repetition of the loud crackling noise which terrified me on the 10th. Though long on the subject, but was unable to form any satisfactory conclusion. Thought long on the subject. Great decrease in the Earth's apparent diameter, which now subtended from the balloon an angle of very little more than 25 degrees. The moon could not be seen at all, being nearly in my zenith. I still continued in the plane of the ellipse, but made little progress to the eastward. April 14th. Extremely rapid decrease in the diameter of the Earth today. I became strongly impressed with the idea the balloon was now actually running up the line of the apsides to the point of perigee. In other words, holding the direct course which would bring it immediately to the moon in that part of its orbit the nearest to the Earth. The moon itself was directly overhead, and consequently hidden from my view. Great and long-continued labor necessary for the condensation of the atmosphere. April 15th. Not even the outlines of continents and seas could now be traced upon the earth with distinctness. About 12 o'clock, I became aware, for the third time, of that appalling sound which had so astonished me before. It now, however, continued for some moments, and gathered intensely as it continued. At length, while stupefied and terror-stricken, I stood in expectation of I knew not what hideous destruction. The car vibrated with excessive violence, and a gigantic and flaming mass of some material which I could not distinguish came with a voice of 1,000 thunders, roaring and booming by the balloon. When my fears and astonishment had in some degree subsided, I had little difficulty in supposing it to be some mighty volcanic fragment ejected from that world to which I was so rapidly approaching, and, in all probability, one of that singular class of substances occasionally picked up on the earth and teemed meteoric stones, for want of a better appellation. April 16th. Today, looking upward as well as I could through each of the side windows alternately, I beheld, to my great delight, a very small portion of the moon's disk protruding, as it were, on all sides beyond the huge circumference of the balloon. My agitation was extreme, for I had now little doubt of soon reaching the end of my perilous voyage. Indeed, the labor now required by the condenser had increased to a most oppressive degree, and allowed me scarcely any respite from exertion. Sleep was a matter nearly out of the question. I became quite ill, and my frame trembled with exhaustion. It was impossible that human nature could endure this state of intense suffering much longer. During the now brief interval of darkness, a meteoric stone again passed in my vicinity, and the frequency of these phenomena began to occasion me much apprehension. April 17th. This morning proved an epoch in my voyage. It will be remembered that on the 13th, the Earth subtended an angular breadth of 25 degrees. On the 14th, this had greatly diminished. On the 15th, a still more remarkable decrease was observable, and on retiring on the night of the 16th, I had noticed an angle of no more than about 7 degrees and 15 minutes. What, therefore, must have been my amazement on awakening from a brief and disturbed slumber on the morning of this day, the 17th, at finding the surface beneath me so suddenly and wonderfully augmented in volume as to subtend no less than 39 degrees in apparent angular diameter. I was thunderstruck. No words can give any adequate idea of the extreme, the absolute horror and astonishment with which I was seized, possessed, and altogether overwhelmed. My knees tottered beneath me. My teeth chattered. My hair started up on end. The balloon, then, had actually burst. There were the first tumultuous ideas that hurried through my mind. The balloon had positively burst. I was falling with the most impetuous, the most unparalleled velocity, to judge by the immense distance already so quickly passed over. It could not be more than 10 minutes at the farthest before I should reach the surface of the earth and be hurled into annihilation. But at length reflection came to my mind, to my relief. I paused, considered, and began to doubt. The matter was impossible. I could not in any reason have so rapidly come down. Besides, although I was evidently approaching the surface below me, it was with speed by no means commensurate with the velocity I had at first conceived. This consideration served to calm the perturbation of my mind, and I finally succeeded in regarding the phenomenon in its proper point of view. In fact, amazement must have fairly deprived me of my senses when I could not see the vast difference in appearance between the surface below me and the surface of my Mother Earth. The latter was indeed over my head and completely hidden by the balloon, while the moon itself in all its glory, lay beneath me at my feet. No sleep and scary meteor sounds make Hans go something something. The moon haunts you. Definitely haunts Hans. The stupor and surprise produced in my mind by this extraordinary change in the posture of affairs was, perhaps, after all, that part of the adventure least susceptible of explanation. For the bouleversement in itself was not only natural and inevitable, but had been long actually anticipated as circumstance to be expected whenever I should arrive at that exact point of my voyage, where the attraction of the planet should be superseded by the attraction of the satellite, or, more precisely, where the gravitation of the balloon toward the Earth should be less powerful than its gravitation toward the moon. To be sure, I arose from a sound slumber, with all my senses in confusion, to the contemplation of a very startling phenomenon, and one which, although expected, was not expected at the moment. The revolution itself must, of course, have taken place in an easy and gradual manner, and it is by no means clear that, had I even been awake at the time of the occurrence, I should have been made aware of it by any internal evidence of an inversion. That is to say, by any inconvenience or disagreement either about my person or about my apparatus. One does not sleep at this point. It is almost needless to say that, upon coming to a due sense of my situation and emerging from the terror which had absorbed every faculty of my soul, my attention was, in the first place, wholly directed to the contemplation of the general physical appearance of the moon. It lay beneath me like a chart, and although I judged it to be still at no inconsiderable distance, the indentures of its surface were defined to my vision the most striking and altogether unaccountable distinctness. The entire absence of ocean or sea, and indeed of any lake or river or body of water whatsoever, struck me, at first glance, as the most extraordinary feature in its geological condition. Yet, strange to say, I beheld vast level regions of a character decidedly alluvial, although by far the greater portion of the hemisphere in sight was covered with innumerable volcanic mountains, conical in shape, and having more the appearance of artificial than of natural protuberances. The highest among them does not exceed 3 3/4 miles in perpendicular elevation, but a map of the volcanic districts of the Campi Flegrei would afford to your excellencies a better idea of their general surface than an unworthy description I might think proper to attempt. The greater part of them were in a state of evident eruption, and gave me fearfully to understand their fury and their power, by the repeated thunders of the miscalled meteoric stones, which now rushed upward by the balloon with a frequency more and more appalling. April 18th. Today I found an enormous increase in the moon's apparent bulk, and the evidently accelerated velocity of my descent began to fill me with alarm. It will be remembered that in the earliest stage of my speculations upon the possibility of a passage to the moon, the existence in its vicinity of an atmosphere dense in proportion to the bulk of the planet had entered largely into my calculations. This, too, in spite of the many theories to the contrary. And it may be added, in spite of a general disbelief in the existence of any lunar atmosphere at all, but in addition to what I have already urged in regard to Encke's comet and the zodiacal light, I had been strengthened in my opinion by certain observations of Mr. Schroeder of Lilienthal. He observed the moon when 2 days and a half old, in the evening soon after sunset, before the dark part was visible, and continued to watch it until it became visible. The 2 cusps appeared tapering in a very sharp, faint prolongation, each exhibiting its furthest extremely faintly illuminated by the solar rays before any part of the dark hemisphere was visible. Soon afterward, the whole dark limb became illuminated. This prolongation of to the cusps beyond the semicircle, I thought, must have arisen from the reflection of the sun's rays by the moon's atmosphere. I computed also the height of the atmosphere, which could refract light enough into its dark hemisphere to produce a twilight more luminous than the light reflected from the earth when the moon is about 32 degrees from the new, to be 1,356 Paris feet in this view. I supposed the greatest height capable of refracting the solar ray to be 5,376 feet. My ideas on this topic had also received confirmation by a passage in the 82nd volume of the Philosophical Transactions, in which it is stated that at an occultation of Jupiter's satellites, the third disappeared after having been about 1 degree or 2 degree of time indistinct. Sorry, that's 1 hour. Or 2 hour of time indistinct, and the fourth became indiscernible near the limb. The balloon didn't burst. He was mistaken. He was completely inverted to from the Earth's gravitational pull to the moon's gravitational pull, which inverted him. But he didn't, he was woken after that occurred. Upon the resistance, or more properly, upon the support of an atmosphere existing in the state of density imagined, I had, of course, entirely depended for the safety of my ultimate descent. Should I then, after all, prove to have been mistaken, I had, in consequence, nothing better to expect, as a finale to my adventure, than being dashed into atoms against the rugged surface of the satellite. And indeed, I had now every reason to be terrified. My distance from the moon was comparatively trifling, while the labor required by the condenser was diminished not at all, and I could discover no indication whatever of a decreasing rarity in the air. April 19th. This morning, to my great joy, about 9 o'clock, the surface of the moon being frightfully near, and my apprehensions excited to the utmost, the pump of my condenser at length gave evident tokens of an alteration in the atmosphere. By 10, I had reason to believe its density considerably increased. By 11, very little labor was necessary at the apparatus, and at 12 o'clock, with some hesitation, I ventured to unscrew the tourniquet, when, finding no inconvenience from having done so, I finally threw open the gum elastic chamber and unrigged it from around the car. As might have been expected, spasms and violent headache were the immediate consequences of an experiment so precipitate and full of danger. But these and other difficulties attending respiration, as they were by no means so great as to put me in peril of my life, I determined to endure as best I could, in consideration of my leaving them behind me momently in my approach to the denser strata near the moon. This approach, however, was still impetuous in the extreme, and it soon became alarmingly certain that, although I had probably not been deceived in the expectation of an atmosphere dense in proportion to the mass of the satellite, still I had been wrong in supposing this density, even at the surface, at all adequate to the support of the great weight contained in the car of my balloon. Yet this should have been the case, and in an equal degree as the surface of the earth the actual gravity of the bodies at the either planet supposed in the ratio of the atmospheric condensation, that it was not the case. However, my precipitous downfall gave testimony enough. Why it was not so can only be explained by a reference to those possible geological disturbances to which I have formerly alluded. At all events, I was now close upon the planet, and coming down with the most terrible impetuosity. I lost not a moment, accordingly, in throwing overboard first my ballast, then my water kegs, then my condensing apparatus and gum elastic chamber, and finally every article within the car. But it was all to no purpose. I still fell with horrible rapidity, and was now not more than half a mile from the surface. As a last resource, thereafter, having got rid of my coat, hat, and boots, I cut loose from the balloon the car itself, which was of no inconsiderable weight, and thus, clinging with both hands to the network, I had barely time to observe that the whole country, as far as the eye could reach, was thickly interspersed with diminutive habitations, ere I tumbled headlong into the very heart of a fantastical-looking city, and into the middle of a vast crowd of ugly little people, who none of them uttered a single syllable or gave themselves the least trouble to render me assistance, but stood like a parcel of idiots, grinning in a ludicrous manner, and eyeing me and my balloon askant, with their arms set akimbo. I turned from them in contempt, and, gazing upward at the earth so lately left, and left perhaps forever, beheld it like a huge, dull, copper shield, about 2 degrees in diameter, fixed immovably in the heavens overhead, and tipped on one of its edges with a crescent border of the most brilliant gold. No traces of land or water could be discovered, and the whole was clouded with variable spots, and belted with tropical and equatorial zones. Thus it may please your excellencies, after a series of great anxieties, unheard of dangers, and unparalleled escapes, I had, at length, on the 19th day of my departure from Rotterdam, arrived in safety at the conclusion of a voyage undoubtedly the most extraordinary and the most momentous ever accomplished, undertaken, or conceived by any denizen of earth. But my adventures yet remain to be related, and indeed your excellencies may well imagine that, after a residence of 5 years upon a planet not only deeply interesting in its own peculiar character, but rendered doubly so by its immediate connection and capacity of satellite with the world inhabited by man, I may have intelligence for the private ear of States College of Astronomers of far more importance than the details, however wonderful, of the mere voyage which so happily concluded. This is, in fact, the case. I have much, very much, which it would give me the greatest pleasure to communicate. I have much to say of the climate of the planet, of its wonderful alternations of heat and cold, of unmitigated and burning sunshine for one fortnight, and more than polar frigidity for the next, of a constant transfer of moisture by distillation, like that in vacuo, from the point beneath the sun to the point the furthest from it, of a variable zone of running water, the people themselves, of their manners, customs, and political institutions, of their peculiar physical construction, of their ugliness, of their want of ears, those useless appendages in an atmosphere so peculiarly modified, of their consequent ignorance of the use and properties of speech, of their substitute for speech in a singular method of intercommunication, of the incomprehensible connection between each particular individual in the moon with some particular individual on the earth, a connection analogous with and depending upon that of the orbs of the planet and in the surface, and by means of which the lives and destinies of the inhabitants of the one are interwoven with the lives and destinies of the inhabitants of the other. And above all, if it so please your excellencies, above all, of those dark and hideous mysteries which lie in the outer regions of the moon, regions which, owing to the almost miraculous accordance of the satellite's rotation on its own axis with the sidereal revolution about the earth, have never yet been turned, and, by God's mercy, never shall be turned to the scrutiny of the telescopes of man. All this and more, much more, I would willingly detail, but to be brief, I must have my reward. I am pining for a return to my family and to my home, and as the price of any further communication on my part, in consideration of the light which I have it in my power to throw upon many very important branches of physical and metaphysical science, I must solicit, though through the influence of your honorable body, a pardon for the crime of which I have been guilty in the death of the creditors upon my departure from Rotterdam. This, then, is the object of the present paper. Its bearer, an inhabitant of the moon, whom I have prevailed upon, and properly instructed to be my messenger to the earth, will await your excellency's pleasure, and return to me with the pardon in question, if it can in any manner be obtained. I have the honor to be, etc., your excellency's very humble servant, Hans Pfaall. End quote. Upon finishing the perusal of this very extraordinary document, Professor Rub-a-Dub it is said, dropped his pipe upon the ground in the extremity of his surprise, and Mynheer Suberbus von Underduk, having taken off his spectacles, wiped them and deposited them in his pocket, so far forgot both himself and his dignity as to turn round 3 times his heel in the quintessence of astonishment and admiration. There was no doubt about the matter. The pardon should be obtained, so at least swore, with a round oath, Professor Rub-a-Dub, and so finally thought the illustrious von Underduk, as he took the arm of his brother in science, and without saying a word, began to make the best of his way home to deliberate upon the measures to be adopted. Having reached the door, however, of the burgomaster's dwelling, the professor ventured to suggest that as the messenger had thought proper to disappear, no doubt frightened to death by the savage appearance of the burghers of Rotterdam, a pardon would be of little use, as no one but a man of the moon would undertake a voyage to so vast a distance. To the truth of this observation the burgomaster assented, and the matter was therefore at an end. Not so, however, rumors and speculations. The letter, having been published, gave rise to a variety of gossip and opinion. Some of the over-wise even made themselves ridiculous by decrying the whole business as nothing better than a hoax. But hoax, with these sort of people, is, I believe, a general term for all matters above their comprehension. For my part, I cannot conceive upon what data they have founded such an accusation. Let us see what they say. Imprimis, that certain wogs in Rotterdam have certain special antipathies to certain burgomasters and astronomers. Secondly, that an odd little dwarf and a bottle conjurer, both of whose ears, for some misdemeanor, have been cut off close to his head, has been missing for several days from the neighboring city of Burgess. Thirdly, that the newspapers which were struck all over the little balloon were newspapers of Holland, and therefore could not have been made in the moon. They were dirty papers, very dirty, and Gluck, the printer, would take his Bible oath to their having been printed in Rotterdam. Fourthly, that Hans Pfaall himself, the drunken villain, and the 3 very idle gentlemen styled his creditors, were all seen no longer than 2 or 3 days ago in a tippling house in the suburbs, having just returned, with money in their pockets from a trip beyond the sea. Lastly, that it is an opinion very generally received, or which ought to be generally received, that the College of Astronomers in the city of Rotterdam, as well as all other colleges in other parts of the world, not to mention colleges and astronomers in general, are, to say the least of the matter, not a whit better, nor greater, nor wiser than they ought to be. Thus ends the unparalleled adventure of one Hans Pfaall. This next one is entitled The Balloon Hoax. Astounding news by express via Norfolk. The Atlantic crossed in 3 days. Signal triumph of Mr. Monarch Mason's flying machine. Arrival at Sullivan's Island near Charleston, South Carolina. Of Mr. Mason, Mr. Robert Holland, Mr. Henson, Mr. Harrison Ainsworth, and 4 others in the steering balloon, Victoria, after a passage of 75 hours from land to land. Full particulars on the voyage. The subjoined jeu d'esprit, with the preceding heading in the magnificent capitals, well interspersed with notes of admiration, was originally published, as a matter of fact, in the New York Sun, a daily newspaper, and therein fully served the purpose of creating indigestible ailment for the Quindex during the few hours intervening between a couple of the Charleston mails. The rush for the sole paper which had the news was something beyond even the prodigious, and, in fact, if, as some assert, the Victoria did not absolutely accomplish the voyage recorded, it will be difficult to assign a reason why she should not have accomplished it. Well, it was the early 1800s. Ballooning was all the rage. The great problem is at length solved. The air, as well as the earth and the ocean, has been subdued by science, and will become a common and convenient highway for mankind. The Atlantic has been actually crossed in a balloon, and this too without difficulty, without any great apparent danger, with thorough control of the machine, and in the inconceivably brief period of 75 hours from shore to shore. By the energy of an agent at Charleston, South Carolina, we are enabled to be the first to furnish the public with a detailed account of this most extraordinary voyage, which was performed between Saturday, the 6th, instant at 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., on Tuesday, the 9th, instant, by Sir Everard Bringhurst, Mr. Osborne, a nephew of Lord Betnick's, Mr. Monk Mason, and Mr. Robert Holland, the well-known aeronauts, Mr. Harrison Ainsworth, author of Jack Sheppard, etc., and Mr. Henson, the projector of the late unsuccessful flying machine, with 2 seamen from Woolwich, in all 8 persons. The particulars furnished below may be relied on as authentic and accurate in every respect, as, with the slight exception, they are copied verbatim from the joint diaries of Mr. Monk Mason and Mr. Harrison Ainsworth, to whose politeness our agent is also indebted for much verbal information respecting the balloon itself, its construction, and other matters of interest. The only alteration in the MS received has been made for the purpose of throwing the hurried account of our agent, Mr. Forsyth, into a connected and intelligible form. The balloon. 2 very dedicated failures of late, those of Mr. Henson and Sir George Cayley, had much weakened the public interest in the subject of aerial navigation. Mr. Henson's scheme, which at first was considered very feasible even by men of science, was founded upon the principle of an inclined plane, starting from an eminence by an extrinsic force applied and continued by the revolution of impinging vanes, in form and number resembling the vanes of a windmill. But in all the experiments made with models at the Adeline Gallery, it was found that the operation of these fans not only did not propel the machine, but actually impeded its flight. The only propelling force it ever exhibited was the mere impetus acquired from the descent of the inclined plane, and this impetus carried the machine further when the vanes were at rest than when they were in motion, a fact which sufficiently demonstrates their inutility, and in the absence of the propelling, which was also the sustaining power, the whole fabric would necessarily descend. This consideration led Sir George Cayley to think only of adapting a propeller to some machine having of itself an independent power of support, in a word, to a balloon. The idea, however, being novel or original with Sir George, only so far as regards the mode of its application to practice, he exhibited a model of his invention at the Polytechnic Institution. The propelling principle or power was here also applied to interrupted surfaces or vanes put in revolution. These vanes were 4 in number, but were found entirely ineffectual in moving the balloon or aiding its ascending power. The whole project was thus a complete failure. It was at this juncture that Mr. Monk Mason, whose voyage from Dover to Weilburg in the balloon Nassau occasioned so much excitement in 1837, conceived the idea of employing the principle of the Archimedean screw for the purpose of propulsion through the air, rightly attributing the failure of Mr. Henson's scheme and of Sir George Cayley's to the interruption of the surface in the independent vanes. He made the first public experiment at Willis's Rooms, but afterward removed his model to the Adeline Gallery. Like Sir George Cayley's balloon, his own was an ellipsoid. Its length was 13 feet 6 inches, height 6 feet 8 inches. It contained about 320 cubic feet of gas, which, if pure hydrogen, would support 21 pounds upon its first inflation, before the gas has time to deteriorate or escape. The weight of the whole machine and apparatus was 17 pounds, leaving about 4 pounds to spare. Beneath the center of the balloon was a frame of light wood, about 9 feet long, and rigged on the balloon itself with a network in the customary manner. From this framework was suspended a wicker basket or car. The screw consists of an axis of hollow brass tube, 18 inches in length, through which, upon a semi-spiral inclined at 15 degrees, pass a series of steel wire radii, 2 feet long, and thus projecting a foot on either side. These radii are connected at the outer extremities by 2 bands of flattened wire, the whole of this manner forming the framework of the screw, which is completed by covering of oiled silk cut into gores, and tightened so as to present a tolerably uniform surface. At each end of its axis, this screw is supported by pillars of hollow brass tube descending from the hoop. In the lower ends of these tubes are holes in which the pivots of the axis revolve. From the end of the axis, which is near the next to the car, proceeds a shaft of steel, connecting the screw with the pinion of a piece of spring machinery fixed in the car. By the operation of this spring, the screw is made to revolve with great rapidity, communicating a progressive motion to the whole. By means of the rudder, the machine was readily turned in any direction. The spring was of great power compared with its dimensions, being capable of raising 45 pounds upon a barrel of 4 inches diameter. After the first turn, and gradually increasing as it was wound up, it weighed altogether 8 pounds 6 ounces. The rudder was a light frame of crane covered with silk, shaped somewhat like a battledore, and was about 3 feet long, and at the widest 1 foot. Its weight was about 2 ounces, could be turned flat and directed upward or downward, as well as to the right or left, and thus enabled the aeronaut to transfer the resistance of the air which, in an inclined position, must generate in its passage, to any side upon which he might desire to act, thus determining the balloon in the opposite direction. This model, which, though want of time, we have necessarily described in an imperfect manner, was put in action at the Adelaide Gallery, where it accomplished a velocity of 5 miles per hour. Although, strange to say, it excited very little interest in comparison with the previous complex machine of Mr. Henson, so resolute is the world to despise anything which carries with it an air of simplicity. To accomplish the great considerum, apologies, I lost my place. To accomplish the great desideratum of aerial navigation, it was very generally supposed that some exceedingly complicated application must be made of some unusually profound principle in dynamics. So well satisfied, however, was Mr. Mason of the ultimate success of his invention, that he determined to construct immediately, if possible, a balloon of sufficient capacity to test the question by a voyage of some extent, the original design being to cross the British Channel, as before in the Nassau balloon. To carry out his views, he solicited and obtained the patronage of Sir Everard Bringhurst and Mr. Osborne, two gentlemen well known for scientific acquirement, and especially for the interest they have exhibited in the progress of aerostation. The project, at the desire of Mr. Osborne, was kept a profound secret from the public, the only persons entrusted with the design being those actually engaged in the construction of the machine, which was built under the superintendence of Mr. Mason, Mr. Holland, Sir Everard Bringhurst, and Mr. Osborne, at the seat of the latter gentleman near Campfire in Wales. Mr. Henson, accompanied by his friend Mr. Ainsworth, was admitted to a private view of the balloon on Saturday last, when the two gentlemen made final arrangements to be included in the adventure. We are not informed for what reason the two seamen were also included in the party, but in the course of a day or two we shall put our readers in possession of the minutest particulars respecting this extraordinary voyage. The balloon is composed of silk, varnished with the liquid gum caoutchouc. It is of vast dimensions, containing more than 40,000 cubic feet of gas, but as coal gas was employed in place of the more expensive and inconvenient hydrogen, the supporting power of the machine, when fully inflated, and immediately after inflation, is not more than about 25,000 pounds. The coal gas is not only much less costly, but is easily procured and managed. For its introduction into common use for purposes of aerostation, we are indebted to Mr. Charles Green. Up to his discovery, the process of inflation was not only exceedingly expensive, but uncertain. 2 and even 3 days have frequently been wasted in futile attempts to procure a sufficiency of hydrogen to fill a balloon, from which it had great tendency to escape, owing to its extreme subtlety and its affinity for the surrounding atmosphere. In a balloon sufficiently perfect to retain its contents of coal gas unaltered in quality or amount for 6 months, an equal quantity of hydrogen could not be maintained in equal purity for 6 weeks. The supporting power being estimated at 2,500 pounds, and the united weights of the party amounting only to about 1,200 pounds, there was left a surplus of 1,300 pounds, of which again 1,200 was exhausted by ballast, arranged in bags of different sizes, with their respective weights marked upon them, by cordage, barometers, telescopes, barrels containing provision for a fortnight, water casks, cloaks, carpet bags, and various other indispensable matters, including a coffee warmer contrived for warming coffee by means of slack lime, so as to dispense altogether with fire, if it should be judged prudent to do so. All these articles, with the exception of the ballast and a few trifles, were suspended from the hoop overhead. The car is much smaller and lighter, in proportion, than the one appended to the model. It is formed of a light wicker, and is wonderfully strong for so frail-looking a machine. Its rim is about 4 feet deep. The rudder is also very much larger in proportion than that of the model, and the screw is considerably smaller. The balloon is furnished besides with a grapnel and a guide rope, which latter is of the most indispensable importance. A few words in explanation will here be necessary for such of our readers as are not conversant with the details of aerostation. As soon as the balloon quits the earth, it is subjected to the influence of many circumstances tending to create a difference in its weight, augmenting or diminishing its ascending power. For example, there may be a disposition of dew upon the silk, to the extent, even, of several 100 pounds. The ballast has then to be thrown out, or the machine may descend, this ballast being discarded, and a clear sunshine evaporating the dew, and at the same time expanding the gas in the silk, the whole will again rapidly ascend. To check this ascent, the only resource is, or rather was, until Mr. Green's invention of the guide rope, the permission of the escape of gas from the valve. But, in the loss of gas, is a proportionate general loss of ascending power, so that, in a comparatively brief period, the best constructed balloon must necessarily exhaust all its resources and come to the earth. This was the great obstacle to voyages of length. The guide rope remains the difficulty in the simplest matter conceivable. It is merely a very long rope which is suffered to trail from the car, and the effect of which is to prevent the balloon from changing its level in any material degree. If, for example, there should be a deposition of moisture upon the silk, and the machine begins to descend in consequence, there will be no necessity for discharging ballast to remedy the increase of weight, for it is remedied, or counteracted, in exactly just proportion, by the deposit on the ground of just so much of the end of the rope as is necessary. If, on the other hand, any circumstances should cause undue levity and consequent ascent, this levity is immediately counteracted by the additional weight of rope upraised from the earth. Thus the balloon can neither ascend nor descend, except within very narrow limits, and its resources, either in gas or ballast, remain comparatively unimpaired. When pausing over an expanse of water, it becomes necessary to employ small kegs of copper or wood filled with liquid ballast of a lighter nature than water. These float and serve all the purposes of a mere rope on land. Another most important office of the guide rope is to point out the direction of the balloon. The rope drags either on land or sea, while the balloon is free. The latter, consequently, is always in advance. When any progress whatever is made, a comparison, therefore, by means of the compass, of the relative positions of the two objects will always indicate the course. In the same way, the angle formed by the rope with the vertical axis of the machine indicates the velocity. When there is no angle, in other words, when the rope hangs perpendicularly, the whole apparatus is stationary, but the larger the angle, that is to say, the further the balloon precedes the end of the rope, the greater the velocity, and the converse. As the original design was to cross the British Channel and alight as near Paris as possible, the voyagers had taken the precaution to prepare themselves with passports directed to all parts of the continent, specifying the nature of the expedition, as in the case of the Nassau voyage, and entitling the adventurers to exemption from the usual formalities of office. Unexpected events, however, rendered these passports superfluous. The inflation was commenced very quietly at daybreak on Saturday morning, the 6th instant, in the courtyard of Wheal Vorhaus, Mr. Osborne's seat, about a mile from Penthorol in North Wales, and at 7 minutes past 11, everything being ready for departure, the balloon was set free, rising gently but steadily in a direction nearly south, no use being made for the first half hour of either the screw or the rudder. We proceeded now with the journal, as transcribed by Mr. Forsyth, from the joint MSS, from the joint emissors of Monarch Mason and Mr. Ainsworth. The body of the journal, as given, is in the handwriting of Mr. Mason, and a P.S. is appended each day by Mr. Ainsworth, who has in preparation and will shortly give the public a more minute and, no doubt, a thrillingly interesting account of the voyage. The Journal. Saturday, April the 6th. Every preparation likely to embarrass us having been made overnight, we commenced the inflation this morning at daybreak, but owing to a thick fog which encumbered the folds of the silk and rendered it unmanageable, we did not get through before nearly 11 o'clock. Cut loose, then, in high spirits, and rose gently but steadily with a light breeze at north, which bore us in the direction of the British Channel. Found the ascending force greater than we had expected, and as we arose higher and so got clear of the cliffs and more in the sun's rays, our ascent became very rapid. I did not wish, however, to lose gas at so early a period on the adventure, and so concluded to ascend for the present. We soon ran out of our guide rope, but even when we had raised it clear of the earth, we still went up very rapidly. The balloon was unusually steady and looked beautifully. In about 10 minutes after starting, the barometer indicated an altitude of 15,000 feet. The weather was remarkably fine, and the view of the subjacent country, a most romantic one when seen from any point, was now especially sublime. The numerous deep gorges presented the appearance of lakes on account of the dense vapors with which they were filled, and the pinnacles and crags to the southeast, piled in inextricable confusion, resembling nothing so much as the giant cities of Eastern fable. We were rapidly approaching the mountains in the south, but our elevation was more than sufficient to enable us to pass them in safety. In a few minutes we soared over them in fine style, and Mr. Ainsworth, with the seamen, was surprised at their apparent want of altitude when viewed from the car. The tendency of great elevation in a balloon being to reduce inequalities of the surface below to nearly a dead level, at 11:30, still proceeding nearly south, we obtained our first view of the Bristol Channel, and in 15 minutes afterward, the line of breakers on the coast appeared immediately beneath us, and we were fairly out at sea. We now resolved to let off enough gas to bring our guide rope, with the buoys affixed, to the water. This was immediately done, and we commenced a gradual descent. In about 20 minutes, our first buoy dipped, and at the touch of the second soon afterward, we remained stationary as to elevation. We were all now anxious to test the efficiency of the rudder and screw, and we put them both into requisition forthwith, for the purpose of altering our direction more to the eastward, and in a line for Paris. By means of the rudder, we instantly effected the necessary change of direction, and our course was brought nearly at right angles to that of the wind, when we set in motion the spring of the screw, and we rejoiced to find it propel us readily as desired. Upon this we gave 9 hearty cheers, and dropped in the sea a bottle, enclosing a slip of parchment with a brief account of the principle of the invention. Hardly, however, had we done with our rejoicings, when an unforeseen accident occurred, which discouraged us in no little degree. The steel rod connecting the spring with the propeller was suddenly jerked out of place at the car end by a swaying of the car through some movement of one of the two seamen we had taken up, and in an instant hung dangling out of reach from the pivot of the axis of the screw. While we were endeavoring to regain it, our attention being completely absorbed, we became involved in a strong current of wind from the east, which bore us with rapidly increasing force toward the Atlantic. We soon found ourselves driving out to sea at a rate of not less, certainly, than 50 or 60 miles an hour, so that we came up with Cape Clear at some 40 miles to our north before we had secured the rod and had time to think what we were about. It was now that Mr. Ainsworth made an extraordinary, but, to my fancy, by no means unreasonable or chimerical proposition, in which he was instantly seconded by Mr. Holland, viz., that we should take advantage of the strong gale which bore us on, and in place of beating back to Paris, make an attempt to reach the coast of North America. After slight reflection, I gave a willing assent to this bold proposition, which, strange to say, met with objection from the two seamen only. As the stronger party, however, we overruled their fears, and kept resolutely upon our course. We steered due west, but as the trailing of the buoys materially impeded our progress, and we had the balloon abundantly at command, either for ascent or descent, we first threw out 50 pounds of ballast, and then wound up, by means of a windlass, so much of the rope as brought it quite clear of the sea. We perceived the effect of this manoeuvre immediately, in a vastly increased rate of progress, and, as the gale freshened, we flew with a velocity nearly inconceivable, the guide rope flying out behind the car like a streamer from a vessel. It is needless to say that a very short time sufficed us to lose sight of the coast. We passed over innumerable vessels of all kind, a few of which were endeavoring to beat up, but the most of them lying to. We occasioned the greatest excitement on board all, an excitement greatly relished by ourselves, and especially by our two men, who now, under the influence of a dram of Geneva, seemed resolved to give all scruple or fear to the wind. Many of the vessels fired signal guns, and in all we were saluted with loud cheers, which we heard with surprising distinctness, and the waving of caps and handkerchiefs. We kept on in this manner throughout the day with no material incident, and as the shades of night closed round us, we made a rough estimate of the distance traversed. It could not have been less than 500 miles, and was probably much more. The propeller was kept in constant operation, and, no doubt, aided our progress materially. As the sun went down, the gale freshened into an absolute hurricane, and the ocean beneath was clearly visible on account of its phosphorescence. The wind was from the east all night, and gave us the brightest omen of success. We suffered no little from cold, and the dampness of the atmosphere was most unpleasant, but the ample space in the car enabled us to lie down, and by means of cloaks and a few blankets, we did sufficiently well. P.S. by Mr. Ainsworth. The last 9 hours have been unquestionably the most exciting of my life. I can conceive nothing more sublimating than the strange peril and novelty of an adventure such as this. May God grant that we succeed. I ask not success for mere safety to my insignificant person, but for the sake of human knowledge and for the vastness of the triumph. And yet the feat is only so evidently feasible that the sole wonder is why men have scrupled to attempt it before. One single gale, such as now befriends us, lets such a tempest whirl forward a balloon for 4 or 5 days. These gales often last longer, and the voyager will be easily borne in that period from coast to coast. In view of such a gale, the broad Atlantic becomes a mere lake. I am more struck just now with the supreme silence which reigns in the sea beneath us, notwithstanding its agitation, than with any other phenomenon presenting itself. The waters give up no voice to the heavens. The immense flaming ocean writhes and is tortured uncomplainingly. The mountainous surges suggest the idea of an innumerable dumb gigantic fiends struggling in impotent agony. In a night such as this, to me, a man lives the whole century of ordinary life, nor would I forego this rapturous delight for that of a whole century of ordinary existence. Sunday the 7th, Mr. Mason, M.S. This morning the gale, by 10, had subsided to an 8 or 9 knot breeze for a vessel at sea, and bears us perhaps 30 miles per hour or more. It has veered, however, very considerably to the north, and now, at sundown, we are holding our course due west, principally by the screw and rudder, which answer to their purposes to admiration. I regard the project as thoroughly successful, and the easy navigation of the air in any direction, not exactly in the teeth of a gale, as no longer problematical. We could not have made head against the strong wind of yesterday, but by ascending we might have got out of its influence, if requisite. Against a pretty stiff breeze, I feel convinced we can make our way with the propeller. At noon today, ascended to an elevation of nearly 25,000 feet. By discharging ballast, did this to search for a more direct current, but found none so favorable as the one we are now in. We have an abundance of gas to take us across this small pond, even should the voyage last 3 weeks. I have not the slightest fear for the result. The difficulty has been strangely exaggerated and misapprehended. I can choose my current, and should I find all currents against me, I can make very tolerable headway with the propeller. We have had no incidents worth recording. The night promises fair. P.S. by Mr. Ainsworth. I have little to record, except the fact, to me quite surprising one, that at an elevation equal to that of Cotopaxi, I experienced neither very intense cold, nor headache, nor difficulty in breathing. Neither did Mr. Mason, nor Mr. Holland, nor Sir Everard. Mr. Osborne complained of constriction of the chest, but this soon wore off. We have flown a great rate during the day, and we must be more than halfway across the Atlantic. We have passed over some 20 or 30 vessels of various kinds, and all seem to be delightfully astonished. Crossing the ocean in a balloon is not so difficult a feat after all. Omne ignoratum pro magnifico. Memor. At 25,000 feet elevation, the sky appears nearly black, and the stars are distinctly visible, while the sea does not seem convex, as one might suppose, but absolutely and most unequivocally concave. Monday the 8th, Mr. Mason's, M.S. This morning we had again some little trouble with the rod of the propeller, which must be entirely remodeled, for fear of serious accident. I mean the steel rod, not the vanes. The latter could not be improved. The wind has been blowing steadily and strongly from the northeast all day, and so far fortune seems bent upon favoring us. Just before day, we were all somewhat alarmed at some odd noises and concussions in the balloon, accompanied with an apparent rapid subsidence of the whole machine. These phenomena were occasioned by the expansion of the gas through increase of heat in the atmosphere and the consequent disruption of the minute particles of ice with which the network had become encrusted during the night. Threw down several bottles to the vessels below. See one of them picked up by a large ship, seemingly one of the New York Line packets. Endeavored to make out her name, but could not be sure of it. Mr. Osborne's telescope made it out something like Atalanta. It is now 12 at night, and we are still going nearly west at a rapid pace. The sea is particularly phosphorescent. P.S. by Mr. Ainsworth. It is now 2 a.m. and nearly calm, as well as I can judge. But it is very difficult to determine this point, since we move with the air so completely. I have not slept since quitting Wheelvore, but can stand it no longer. Must take a nap. Cannot be far from the American coast. Tuesday the 9th, Mr. Ainsworth, missive. 1 p.m. We are in full view of the low coast of South Carolina. The great problem is accomplished. We have crossed the Atlantic, fairly and easily crossed it in a balloon. God be praised. Who shall say that anything is impossible hereafter? The journal here ceases. Some particulars of the descent were communicated, however, by Mr. Ainsworth to Mr. Forsyth. It was nearly dead calm when the voyagers first came in view of the coast, which was immediately recognized by both the seamen and by Mr. Osborne. The latter gentleman having acquaintances at Fort Moultrie, it was immediately resolved to descend in its vicinity. The balloon was brought over the breach, the tide being out and the sand hard, smooth, and admirably adapted for a descent. And the grapnel let go, which took firm hold at once. The inhabitants of the island and of the fort thronged out, of course, to see the balloon, but it was with the greatest difficulty that any one could be made to credit the actual voyage, the crossing of the Atlantic. The grapnel caught at 2 p.m. precisely, and thus the whole voyage was completed in 75 hours, or rather less, counting from shore to shore. No serious accident occurred. No real danger was at any time apprehended. The balloon was exhausted and secured without trouble, and when the missives from which this narrative is compiled was dispatched from Charleston, the party was still at Fort Moultrie. Their further intentions were not ascertained, but we can safely promise our readers some additional information either on Monday or in the course of the next day at furthest. This is unquestionably the most stupendous, the most interesting, and the most important undertaking ever accomplished or even attempted by man. What magnificent events may ensue, it would be useless now to think of determining. Ends the balloon hoax. I'm going to call it there. It's almost 5:30 here. I've been going for 3.5 hours. My voice is a little hoarse. And I'm going to go get some sushi tonight. So let's see whom we can raid out to. Oh, Whisper. Whisper's been up. He raided me yesterday. So we're gonna raid him on the Twitch side. So quick shout out. Oh God. Maybe that's the wrong thing. That should be correct. Unless I did that wrong. Let me try that again. Is that the right way to do it? No. Exclamation point SO/at. That might be that. I think that's the way. To hell with it. Oh, Whispered just went offline. Damn it. Now I figured out how to do it. So let's see, who else are we following? Oh, with a... I did that. That's weird. Can I raid Yomi? Yomi's just chatting. Well, I can. All right, Yomi's fun. She's a little chaotic. All right, so. Failed to send message. What? It still says failed to send message on this. I'm trying to do it in the multi-stream chat. So / shout out. Let me try this in the actual OBS chat. Did that work? Oh, great. Oh, I need to install it, but that is their name. After I've tried like 5 times. But on the Kickstarter, I want to thank you all for coming out, and I will see you next time.